Echoes of the forgotten Earth speaking to you now, and I'd like to invite you into a slower kind of wondering. Welcome, not to just about Earth, but to this quiet channel where we let questions drift, where curiosity moves at a walking pace, and science is allowed to take the long way around. Tonight, we're going to unspool one of the most lingering, almost ghostly questions humanity has ever turned over in its mind. What if the very first civilization on this planet never truly vanished at all? What if it's still here, not on the continents we know, but hidden beneath the oceans? At first, that sounds like something that belongs strictly to legend or fantasy. Yet the longer you let the idea settle in the back of your thoughts, the more it begins to feel less like a wild tale and more like a possibility that deserves patient attention. Before we drift any farther, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from right now? Are you somewhere near the shore, where the air sometimes carries that faint sting of salt? Or are you far inland, in a place where the ocean feels more like an abstract idea than a neighbor? And when was the last time you stood beside any stretch of water and ocean, a lake, a river, and let your mind wander down past the surface, wondering what might be moving in the dark below? Most of us have had that moment, staring into the black glass of a lake at night, leaning over a pier while waves slide in and out, watching swells gather, rise, and collapse into themselves over and over. There's a quiet, persistent mystery in that unseen space. It doesn't take much effort to imagine that something older and more intricate than fish and currents could be waiting there. If this kind of slow, unfolding exploration makes you feel calmer, more grounded, I'd be thankful if you chose to like or subscribe. It helps this small, gentle corner of the internet find others who might also need somewhere unhurried to think. Nothing here will shout at you. Nothing is designed to overwhelm. We just set ideas afloat and see where the tide carries them. So let's begin, not by reaching for conclusions, but by sitting with questions. What if the first real experiment in organized human life didn't begin on dry ground at all, but in the shallow coastal waters of a world whose shorelines no longer exist? Coasts that have long since been swallowed by rising seas. What if the descendants of those early people didn't disappear when the water rose, but adapted? While the civilizations we know pushed inland across plains, deserts, and mountains, could there have been a different lineage? One that slipped under the waves and simply never came back to the surface? That idea feels less far-fetched when we remind ourselves how little we actually know about the ocean. Almost 3/4 of our planet is covered in it, and yet more than 80% of the seafloor remains unmapped in detail, unseen, barely touched. We have clearer images of Mars tens of millions of miles away than of the ridges, canyons, and plains that lie beneath our own waves. When something as close and constant as the sea can remain this hidden, it isn't unreasonable to ask whether entire chapters of history might be resting down there, sealed away from our sight. Humans, it seems, have always suspected as much. Tales of drowned lands and sunken kingdoms drift through nearly every tradition on Earth. The Greeks spoke of Atlantis, a place of great knowledge and power taken by the sea. In India, stories describe coastal cities claimed by the tide, their highest points shimmering beneath clear water on certain days. Across the Pacific, many islands hold oral histories of lands that once stood dry, but now rest far below the surface. Whether those stories are direct memories of ancient floods or something more symbolic, they share a clear refrain: the ocean doesn't only destroy, it conceals. If you stood on a shoreline thousands of years ago, it would be easy to believe the sea could hide absolutely anything. There were no diving masks, no cameras, no sonar. The surface was a solid, glittering veil. People could only guess what waited below. Now and then a storm would fling something strange onto the beach: an unfamiliar fish, a piece of branching coral, a shell shaped like nothing anyone had seen before. Each object was a message from an unseen world. If life could take that many unexpected forms down there, who could honestly claim that human-shaped life couldn't be among them? The logic behind civilizations rising on land is straightforward. Farming wants dry soil and predictable weather. Fire needs air. Metalworking is easier where fuel can burn and tools can be hammered in the open. But what if the very earliest organized communities of our species, or even of something that came before us, chose not to follow that logic? Maybe they lived during a time when coastlines were drawn differently, when glaciers melted fast, sea levels jumped, and shore communities had to decide, abandon the water or follow it. Archaeology tells us that at the end of the last ice age, seas rose dramatically. Huge areas that were once broad grasslands or river valleys now lie underwater. Doggerland, the Great Plain that once connected Britain to mainland Europe, is one such example. In the region of the Black Sea, evidence suggests that a powerful flood may have widened its boundaries within the span of human memory. If people were already living along those ancient coasts, they would have faced a stark choice: move inland with the retreating land, or remain with the advancing sea. It's likely that most went inland. That trajectory matches the story we tell about ourselves. But does most have to mean all? We already know that human bodies with training can endure surprisingly long periods without breathing. We also know that evolution quietly rewards survival. If small bands of people began to dive deeper, fish farther from shore, build makeshift shelters in submerged caves, and slowly reshape their lives around conditions we now label extreme, could that have marked the beginning of a hidden, continuous line? And when we talk about civilization, we often picture monuments and writing. But at its core, civilization is cooperation, structure, shared knowledge, the ability to carry culture across generations. Those qualities can exist in many physical forms. If a very early community organized itself beneath the sea, using coral reefs, kelp forests, or submerged ridges as frameworks, we might not recognize it as a city at all. We expect walls, plazas, straight streets. Their version of a settlement might blend so thoroughly with its environment that even if one of our submersibles drifted past, we'd log it simply as an unusual reef. This possibility becomes sharper if we think about how completely the ocean narrows our perspective. Sunlight fades out by about 200 meters. Below that, the deep sea is a domain of darkness, punctuated only by the cold lamps of bioluminescent life. Pressure climbs quickly with depth, making every expedition technically difficult and expensive. Radio communication, which we take for granted in air, fails underwater in a matter of meters. We visited only a sliver of this world with crude subs and remote vehicles, and even then usually for minutes or hours at a time. The rest stays hidden behind a wall of sheer physical inaccessibility. The idea that an ancient civilization might still be there, living in that darkness, depends partly on that inaccessibility. It offers a simple explanation for why we haven't found clear traces. On land, archaeology feels increasingly detailed. Underwater, we're still at the stage of rough sketches. If they survive by weaving themselves tightly into ocean systems, their tools and structures would likely look nothing like our own. They wouldn't leave behind the familiar signatures we rely on: weathered blocks, rusting metal, broken pottery. Their technology might be almost indistinguishable from coral, rock, or living tissue. The only hints we'd ever see might arrive in the rare moments when storms, erosion, or tectonic shifts lift something up towards shallower water. Even if you set aside belief in that specific scenario, it's worth asking why we keep circling back to it. Why does humanity return, over and over, to stories about peoples under the sea? We tell and retell these tales, not just because we fear losing things, but because the ocean feels like a second, unwritten timeline, running just below our own. A history that refuses to show itself until we learn how to truly look. Every time a sonar scan reveals an unexpected pattern, every time divers stumble onto submerged structures that look unnervingly intentional, our imaginations hurry to fill in what the data can't yet say. Pause for a moment and picture what daily life might be for such a civilization. Light would not define their world, so perhaps sound would. Whales and dolphins already use echoes to build sophisticated mental maps. Maybe an underwater people would do the same, sending out clicks, hums, or low pulses, and reading the returning vibrations as clearly as we read street signs. Vision might work differently too. Eyes adapted to faint glows, paired with forms of communication that use living light patterns rippling across skin the way cuttlefish already do. Talking could look like shimmering. Their homes wouldn't soar upward like towers. Instead, they might stretch along seabed ridges, braced against currents, strengthened by coral skeletons or volcanic stone. Food wouldn't grow in plowed fields, but in schools of fish, shellfish gardens, or the bizarrely rich communities clustered around hydrothermal vents. Energy might come not from burning, but from temperature differences between hot vent water and cold, deep sea, from chemical gradients, from harnessing currents and buoyancy. None of those systems would leave behind the kind of ruins we dig up on land. They dissolve back into the ocean's body. But maybe the key question isn't, are they real? So much as, what happens to us when we consider that they might be? Because the moment we truly entertain that possibility, we accept that our story is not automatically the whole story. It's a humbling thought that while we raised skyscrapers and launched satellites, someone else might have taken the opposite path, towards silence, obscurity, and endurance in the dark. We may never meet them, but holding space for the idea that we're not the only long-lived culture on this planet reminds us how much of Earth we haven't actually claimed, understood, or even seen. And if, by some chance, such a people do exist, perhaps they've already wondered about us. Strange land dwellers crowded onto narrow bands of soil, building high yet fragile, forever in uneasy conversation with rising seas, uneasy with the element that covers most of our home. To them, we might look impulsive, temporary, while they, anchored in depths that change slowly, might feel patient and almost timeless. That doesn't have to be frightening. It can simply widen our view of what survival looks like. Because not every story of endurance follows the same outline. Whether or not an underwater civilization is truly out there, the idea changes the way we see the ocean. It stops being just water, just resource, just backdrop. It becomes a potential homeland, a place that might hold minds not so different from ours. Keeping that thought steady prepares us to re-examine the stories we've always told about what lives beneath the waves. Stories that might, in their symbols and metaphors, be carrying small pieces of truth we've been too quick to dismiss. Echoes of the Forgotten Earth will continue in the next part with the ocean's myths and memories, how our oldest stories may be the first maps pointing down into the dark. When human beings first began to explain the world to one another, the ocean stepped into the role of main character almost immediately. Before stone temples, before written chronicles, before shelves of books, there were gatherings by the shore and circles around fires, voices telling how things began. What forces shaped the land, what powers had to be respected. The sea was never just water. It was border, threat, provider, path, and mystery all at once. It could swallow fields and homes without warning. It sent back fish and driftwood and sometimes the bodies of those who didn't return. It hid creatures big enough to overturn boats and lights that flickered under the surface. When something in the world held that much power, meaning had to be woven into it. Myth became the natural fabric for that meaning. Across cultures, the ocean appears at the root of creation. In Mesopotamia, some of the oldest surviving texts describe primordial waters birthing both gods and monsters, order and chaos emerging side by side from a boundless deep. In ancient Egypt, the dark, still waters of none existed before everything else. From that undifferentiated flood, the first mound of creation rose. In Polynesian traditions, the sea is not background scenery, it's kin, filled with deities who guide, tease, and test mortals. In the Hebrew Bible, the opening scene shows spirit moving over the waters, a sign that chaos and the deep are bound tightly to the act of creation itself. Again and again, beginnings are painted on a watery canvas. If myth preserves even fractured memories, perhaps these stories hold more than we usually grant them. We know from geology and paleoclimate studies that floods absolutely occurred. As the last great ice sheets retreated, seas rose by hundreds of feet, shorelines advanced inland, valleys drowned. For people living in those ages of change, it must have felt as if the whole world were coming apart. Villages gone within a lifetime, fertile land erased, families pushed into unfamiliar interiors. Those experiences demanded stories, explanations you could pass on to children who would never see the drowned land themselves. But stories didn't just explain, they remembered. They encoded experience into images bright enough, strange enough to be carried for centuries. So when a culture tells of a proud city swallowed by the ocean, we often read it as a lesson about arrogance or divine wrath. Yet maybe, beneath the symbolism, there's also a more literal thread. A recollection of real neighbors, real towns, real walls disappearing under rising water. Maybe people remembered glimpses of buildings through clear shallows. Maybe bits of carved stone came up tangled in nets. Over time, those observations turned into narratives of whole worlds below the sea. In that way, myth stops looking like pure fantasy and starts to resemble a kind of memory one that's been translated into a language of gods, heroes, and curses so it can survive long after the specific details are lost. Think about Atlantis. Most of us know that name as shorthand for any grand civilization lost to the sea. But in its earliest written form, in Plato's dialogues, it wasn't presented as a fairy story. It was framed as inherited history, an island empire beyond the Pillars of Hercules, powerful, sophisticated, then gone in a single catastrophic night. Did Plato invent it as allegory? Did he weave together older flood tales? Did he distort some dim record of real coastal disasters? We can't say with certainty. What we do know is that the story resonated powerfully because it fit a pattern humans already recognized. Water takes, and when it takes, it hides. And Atlantis is only one voice in a global choir. Off India's west coast, sonar and dives near modern Gujarat have revealed submerged structures that some argue look like remnants of ancient cities. In Japan, around Yonaguni, divers found stepped formations and terraces under the waves that have fueled long, heated debates. Is this the work of erosion? Or did human hands help shape it? The arguments themselves tell us something. When we see stone shapes under the sea, we don't think random geology first. We think ruins. We are ready, almost eager to connect underwater structures to old stories. In the Pacific, island cultures from Samoa to Tonga to Hawaii hold epics about journeys beneath the sea, visits to entire realms down there, with coral palaces, living gates, and rulers who move between water and land. In Norse myth, the seas are roads for ships, but also the domain of Jörmungandr, the world serpent so vast it encircles everything. Among the Maya, the underworld is a damp, watery place filled with rivers, caves, and pools that souls must cross. Again and again, water is described as a gate to another world. Sometimes that realm shelters the dead, sometimes gods, sometimes whole societies. The ocean also shaped myths at a very practical level. For fishing and seafaring peoples, the sea wasn't an abstraction, it was daily reality. Every storm that tore nets or cracked hulls, every strange catch, every shoreline home pulled away by a freak wave reinforced the impression that the sea had moods, will, personality. If it could take lives and return bodies, why couldn't it also take or hide whole peoples? Those myths became more than entertainment. They were teaching tools. Stories of deities beneath the waves or proud cities overcome by water carried practical lessons under their metaphors. Respect the sea. Don't underestimate it. Nothing stays fixed. Be prepared to move when the water does. Myth became survival knowledge, coded in images vivid enough that you didn't forget them. In modern times, we often press myths to answer only one question. Did this literally happen? And if the answer seems to be no, we toss them aside as fiction. But if we allow a second question, what memory or warning might be buried in this? Those same myths expand. They start to look like cultural hard drives, carrying compressed backups of long-term relationships with a changing ocean. It's not hard to picture an early fishers community pulling up something that clearly wasn't natural: a worked stone, a carved figure, a shard of decorated ceramic, without any framework for archaeological interpretation. How would they describe it? They'd do the one thing humans have always done when facing the inexplicable: turn it into a story. Over generations, those fragments of direct observation would be draped with meaning, expanded, dramatized. What started as, "We found a strange object from below," could become, "There is a city down there. We once lived with them. Then the sea took them. Sometimes they still speak." And in a way, that's not wrong. It's just myth's way of preserving a truth when the details have blurred. The ocean in particular almost demands story. You can climb a mountain. You can walk across a desert. You can stand within a forest and see the trees around you. But you can sail for weeks across open water and never glimpse what's below your keel. For early humans, that was an almost unbearable kind of ignorance. They needed to put something there. Gods, monsters, cities, not just to soothe fear, but to make the world feel coherent. Underwater civilizations, then, are not just imaginative flourishes. They're one of the most natural ways we have of saying, the unknown is not empty. Even now, with submersibles and sonar, that impulse hasn't gone away. Every documentary about the deep sea, every blurred side scan image of something geometric on the seafloor, every diver's tale of discovering stonework where no chart claims it should be, these all tug at the same thread. We like to think we've outgrown myths, but in practice we've just changed their costumes. Stories of hidden cities beneath the ocean continue to feel strangely reasonable to many people. You can tell someone a story about a secret community in the clouds, and it will usually get a polite smile. Talk about hidden cities under the sea, and people pause. They've heard that one before, even if they can't place from where. Myth has already tilled the soil in our minds, so new seeds of speculation sink in easily. So when we ask whether the first civilization might have chosen the sea instead of land, and might still be quietly alive down there, we're not inventing from nothing. We're joining a very old line of questioning, one that our ancestors expressed through gods, dragons, palaces of coral, and kingdoms below. The ocean as a cradle of myth tells us as much about ourselves as it does about anything that may or may not live there. It shows how we respond when faced with something that refuses to reveal itself all at once. We turn fear into narrative. We turn half-seen events into legend. We smuggle memory forward through symbols. And sometimes, those symbols carry more than metaphor. Sometimes, buried in the image of a city of light beneath the waves, there's the faint echo of real coasts lost, real people displaced, maybe even real attempts to adapt in ways we no longer remember. If any civilization did survive the floods by going down instead of up, it's entirely possible that the first evidence we'll ever recognize won't be stone or metal. It will be the stories we've been telling ourselves all along. From here, it feels natural to keep following that thread. If myths of underwater realms are more than fantasy, what exactly might they be describing? Not just as fairy tales, but as half-remembered glimpses of a society that truly lived and maybe still lives beneath the sea. When people hear the phrase, lost civilization, their minds usually jump to specific images: ruins half buried in desert sand, temples swallowed by jungle, stone streets slowly cracking under tree roots. On land, discovery tends to look like that, revelations of places that stopped breathing centuries ago. But the moment we start considering a civilization under the sea, the word lost itself begins to feel slippery. Maybe it isn't lost at all. Maybe it's simply hidden. And that difference changes nearly everything. When we say something is lost, we usually mean it in a final way. A language no one speaks anymore. A culture fully absorbed into others. a city leveled and built over so many times, its original identity is gone. Lost implies a closed door. Hidden, though, suggests presence. It means something still exists, just beyond our view or understanding. It might be buried, camouflaged, or deliberately concealed, but it's still there. So, when we ask what happened to the very first civilization, if it did choose the ocean, we have to be careful with our language. Did it truly vanish? Or did it slip into a place where our usual methods of looking can't easily follow? Our experience on land should make us humble here. The ruins of Troy were long considered purely legendary, until excavations revealed a city where the stories said it once stood. Machu Picchu was unknown to the outside world until barely more than a century ago. In the Amazon, enormous networks of ancient settlements went unnoticed until modern LiDAR scanning peeled back the jungle canopy from above, revealing roadways, mounds, and plazas no one expected. Those were all on the same solid ground we've been farming, building on, and mapping for thousands of years. Now stretch that humility over the ocean, 360 million square kilometers of surface, with an average depth of about 4 kilometers, plunging down into trenches more than twice that. Most of our seabed maps are really low-resolution estimates. They tell us roughly how deep the bottom is, not what's sitting there. We've missed entire underwater mountain ranges until recently. In that context, missing signs of a small, deeply adapted civilization, if it exists, would be the rule, not the exception. And it isn't just physical traces that can be hidden. Whole cultural records can slip into obscurity without ever touching the water. Oral traditions get dismissed as myth. Stories told in one language are misinterpreted when translated into another. Symbols carved into stone become decorative, their original meaning forgotten. Sometimes what we call lost knowledge is simply knowledge waiting for us to read it correctly. If an early civilization chose to adapt to life under the sea, its traces wouldn't look like our idea of ruins at all. No right-angled boulevards, no metal scaffolding, no familiar architecture eroding into dust. Their mark on the world might be integrated so deeply into natural structures that we've walked, or rather, sailed right past it for generations. The ocean itself is extremely good at helping such things stay hidden. Saltwater chews up iron and steel. Wood rots. Clear lines soften. At the same time, in certain conditions, shipwrecks and organic remains can be preserved for centuries or longer, protected by cold, darkness, and a lack of oxygen. Sediment settles. Currents cover. Volcanic activity reshapes the seabed. Pressure compresses everything into layers. Preservation and concealment happen simultaneously. The ocean doesn't just erase, it tucks things away. That means whatever lies down there, natural or constructed, is not necessarily gone. It may simply be wrapped in the environmental equivalent of a thick, opaque blanket. Imagine for a moment what it would mean if we're not dealing with a vanished people, but a hidden one. That would suggest a choice. Perhaps as the seas rose, some coastal communities decided to move inland, following the path that led to the civilizations we know. But maybe others made a different decision. Stay with the changing water. Learn to live with it, step within it. Generation by generation, they could have pushed farther from the shore, not back, but down. If that choice was made 10 or 15,000 years ago, we're not talking about ghosts. We're talking about neighbors who've had as long as we have or longer to refine their way of life. So why haven't we noticed? We like to believe that with our sonar, underwater cables, ROVs, research vessels, satellites, and military monitoring systems, nothing significant could move in our oceans without being logged. But that confidence frays when we remember scale and method. Most seafloor mapping is done at coarse resolutions, enough for navigation and broad science, not for identifying subtle structures. Deep expeditions are tiny needles sampling a planet-sized haystack. Even our military listening networks are tuned to particular frequencies and behaviors, not to detect an intelligent society that has had millennia to learn how not to be heard. And then there's the possibility that secrecy isn't an accident. It's strategy. If such a civilization exists, they've watched us from below as we industrialized. They've heard the rising roar of propellers and engines, felt shockwaves from tests and drilling, watched nets drag, seen oil and plastic filter down. Our arrival in the ocean's deeper layers has not been gentle. Looking at human behavior on land colonization, resource extraction, wars, what reason would they have to trust us with their existence? History shows again and again that when two cultures meet and one holds a strong technological or numerical advantage, the smaller or less aggressive one usually suffers most. Knowing that, a hidden underwater people might reasonably decide that their best hope of surviving the land dwellers is to remain a rumor. From our side, that deliberate invisibility looks exactly like absence. Skeptics will point out correctly that extraordinary ideas require strong evidence. So far, we don't have a single conclusive artifact, structure, or organism we can point to and say, this was made by an underwater civilization that still lives. Responsible science needs to acknowledge that. But we haven't found it yet is not the same as it cannot be. Especially in a realm as hard to explore as the deep ocean. What's striking is how persistently the idea returns. Atlantis, R'lyeh, cities in glass domes, kingdoms of coral. From ancient epics to modern novels, from oral songs to streaming series, the pattern doesn't go away. The human imagination keeps placing organized, intentional life beneath the waves. At the same time, reality keeps feeding that impulse. Odd sonar readings that don't match expected geology. Objects tracked moving underwater at speeds or angles we can't easily explain. Terracing in shapes on the seabed that spark genuine debate among geologists and archaeologists. Most of these cases end with insufficient data. That's not proof of anything extraordinary, but each unresolved anomaly nudges the door open a little wider. Another helpful correction to our assumptions is scale. When we imagine a civilization, our minds leap to empires, millions of people, continental influence, vast cities. But the first steps into organized culture on land were small, villages, tribes, clusters of farms, a few hundred people cooperating on shared projects. It wouldn't take sprawling undersea metropolises to qualify as a civilization. A network of modest, highly adapted communities could do it. If such groups are distributed, spread out across ridges, vents, and continental slopes, each small on its own, that would make them even harder to detect than a single concentrated Atlantis. The core requirements for civilization: shared knowledge, long-term continuity, cooperation, some form of technology, don't demand skyscrapers. They demand survival strategies that can be passed down. If a people beneath the sea possess those in whatever form suits their world, they count every bit as much as we do. So perhaps the sharpest question isn't whether they're lost or hidden, but what we even mean by discovery. If they are alive and prefer to avoid us, what right do we have to insist on finding them? If they are gone, but their traces and stories live on in myths and in the rocks of drowned coastlines, then in a way they are still present in our imagination, in our cautionary tales, in the way we sense mystery when we face the open water. Either way, the ocean itself refuses to be empty. It is memory in motion. It is secrecy as a physical environment. And thinking of it that way leads naturally to another question. If something down there is hidden, and if it doesn't want to be seen, how do we even begin to listen? What tools, concepts, and senses do we have, or might we need, to catch the faintest hints of a civilization that chose currents instead of roads? From here, we have to turn to the sea's own language, sound. Anytime we try to picture an underwater civilization, we run into the same question almost immediately. How would they talk to each other? We're so used to spoken language riding on air that we forget how deeply sound changes once you step into water. The ocean doesn't handle voices the way the atmosphere does. It bends sound, swallows certain frequencies, and carries others across astonishing distances. If we want even a rough mental image of life below the surface, we first have to accept that the medium itself, water, would be part of the language. The ocean is already alive with communication. Whales send out songs that can travel hundreds of miles, low notes humming through entire basins. Dolphins fire off rapid clicks and whistles, using the returning echoes to build detailed three-dimensional maps. Snapping shrimp collectively generate such intense crackling that some coastal waters sound like a constant frying pan in hydrophone recordings. Many fish grunt, hum, knock, or drum. What seems like silence to us is actually a dense conversation, one we mostly don't hear because it operates outside the narrow band our ears and attention are tuned to. Sound moves about 4 times faster in water than in air and travels farther because water is denser. The ocean is, in many ways, built for acoustic communication. If an early civilization adapted to that world, it would be strange if they didn't lean heavily on sound, but probably not in the form of breath-based speech. Spoken human language relies on shaped air pushed past vocal cords, with consonants and vowels designed for low-density gas. Underwater, air escapes, consonants blur, and our mouths and throats just aren't built for efficient signaling in that medium. So an undersea language might be built from pulses, tones, and patterns rather than syllables. Meaning could be carried less by the precise shape of a word, and more by timing, pitch, and rhythm, closer to drumming or music than to the kind of speech we're used to. We can already see hints of what this might look like within our own species. Divers, unable to rely on speech, use hand signs. Freedivers often describe the feeling that the ocean itself is constantly speaking, waves roaring from above, distant ice cracking, whales calling, ships rumbling. They talk about sensing layers of sound more than decoding them. Even our early instruments flutes mimicking wind, drums echoing thunder and waves may be echoes of a time when listening to water and sky shaped our sense of what communication could be. For people who live underwater, communication wouldn't stop at sound. Light, or the absence of it, would also become a language. Once you descend past a few hundred meters, sunlight fades out, but the deep ocean isn't pitch black. It's filled with living light. Jellyfish, bacteria, squid, fish, and countless other organisms glow, flash, or shimmer. They use bioluminescence to attract mates, warn predators, confuse prey, coordinate movements. Squid and cuttlefish can change complex skin patterns in milliseconds, sending waves of color and brightness across their bodies. Scientists already suspect that at least some of those displays carry information beyond simple camouflage. An underwater civilization growing up alongside all this would almost certainly notice. It's easy to imagine sound and light forming a dual communication system. A sound pulse paired with a flash or pattern of glow, each layer adding nuance. To us, that might look like chaos, flickers of blue and green in the dark, punctuated by mysterious hums. To them, it could be as structured as a paragraph, with entire conversations woven into the interplay between vibration and light. This kind of multi-sensory layered language also gives a fresh angle on some old myths, stories about sirens singing, or mermaids with voices that draw sailors in, might be fragments of memories of complex vocalizations, from whales, from unknown creatures, or even, in the most speculative version, from other intelligent beings. Tales of undersea palaces glowing with jewels may be human attempts to describe bioluminescent communities seen from the surface or in shallow water. Coral, fish, and bacteria lighting up rock and reef can easily look, in the right moment, like a city shining in the dark. Our own efforts to listen to the sea have already revealed noises we can't fully explain. Hydrophones placed across the oceans have recorded a whole catalog of unidentified sounds. Booms, wails, rising sweeps, strange mechanical-sounding pulses. One of the most famous was nicknamed the Bloop in the late 1990s. It was loud enough to be picked up across vast distances and initially baffled researchers. The leading explanation now points to ice fracturing rather than a living source, but the fascination with the idea that it could have been something alive lingers. Whether specific sounds like the bloop come from ice, geology, or biology, they remind us that the ocean speaks in ways we still don't fully understand. Our sensors might already be catching snippets of communication, or of something that looks very much like it, without us recognizing it as such. For any long-lived society, communication isn't just about daily coordination. It's about memory, about preserving knowledge through time. On land, we eventually invented writing to externalize memory. Before that, we relied on oral traditions, chants, epics, and storytelling. Rhythm and melody made information easier to remember and transmit. A civilization beneath the waves might evolve something similar. Libraries made of song instead of paper. Long, patterned acoustic sequences passed down, repeated exactly, each carrying navigation routes, histories, spiritual beliefs, ecological knowledge. Many of our own indigenous cultures still hold vast amounts of knowledge in this form. Songlines, ceremonial chants, long recitations, all of them show how robust oral memory can be. Underwater, where writing with ink on fragile surfaces is impractical and fire doesn't exist, a sound-based archive would make sense. Their books might be community members trained for years to carry specific acoustic cycles. Their archives might be spaces built or grown to resonate in certain ways, reinforcing particular patterns. That leads naturally to the idea of architecture as part of communication. We tend to think of buildings as static shapes, but underwater, structures can interact with sound directly. A hall carved with certain curves might amplify a low-frequency signal across miles. A tunnel with carefully tuned dimensions could create a standing tone whenever current flows through it. To us, a ridge or stone arch might look like an ordinary feature. To them, it could be a beacon, a broadcast tower sculpted to sing. In such a world, technology might be defined not by metal and electricity, but by how well it organizes sound and light. Tools could include grown structures that resonate at specific frequencies or choral matrices that glow in particular sequences. Silence, in this context, becomes just as meaningful as sound. The deep sea can be incredibly noisy during storms or near certain animals, but it can also be so still that a single distant crack or call feels overwhelming. Pauses in communication, deliberate absences of sound or darkening of light could carry meaning as strong as any signal. A long silence might indicate mourning or caution, or the presence of a predator. An area with no bioluminescent display at all might be understood as forbidden, sacred, or dangerous. We already use pauses, glances, and silence to say things words can't. They could do the same with the entire ocean as their medium. Touch and pressure add further layers. Underwater, movement creates currents and vibrations that bodies can feel. Many marine animals already use their lateral lines or other sensory systems to detect those subtle flows. And underwater people might incorporate that into communication. Close contact pulses, shared currents, patterns of movement brushed against one another. Sound, light, vibration, and touch would blend into a communication system more complex than anything we've experienced. To us, it would be nearly invisible, because we're trained to prioritize spoken words and visible gesture. That raises a sobering thought. Maybe they've been signaling all along, in ways we simply aren't built or haven't learned to interpret. Even with animals we know are intelligent, like whales, dolphins, or octopuses, we've only managed the barest first steps in understanding their communication. We can identify repeated song patterns, correlate some sounds with certain behaviors, but the deeper structure of their language, if that's the right word, remains unclear. If we struggle this much with neighbors we can see and tag, imagine how much we might miss from beings who have no interest in being studied. There's another side to this too. Our own noise. To any life living in the ocean, modern human activity must sound deafening. Ship engines, military sonar, oil exploration blasts, offshore construction, fishing gear, all create layers of low-frequency and high-frequency noise. In many regions, what was once a relatively clean acoustic environment has become a constant background roar. If someone is down there, they would have no trouble noticing us. The question is, what they think of what they hear. Do they interpret our soundscape as communication, confusion, aggression, clumsiness? We talk a lot about searching for intelligent life in the universe, sending radio messages into space, listening for replies. But in the sea, we've already filled the medium with our own accidental signals, whether we meant to speak or not. If there is a civilization under the waves, they might already know a great deal about us just from listening, and may have decided, based on that staying out of sight is the wisest move. Seeing the ocean as a place where language is not limited to our concept of speech shifts how we think about looking for others. Instead of only pointing cameras and scanning for geometric ruins, we'd have to learn to listen differently, to treat recurring sound patterns as possible texts, to see synchronized light as potential syntax, to read currents and pulses as we would read ink on a page. And once you start thinking in those terms, the ocean stops feeling like a silent void and starts to look like a vast, ongoing conversation. One we've only just realized we're overhearing. From here, it's natural to turn back to the stories humans have told about direct encounters with mysterious voices and figures in the deep. Maybe those weren't just flourishes of imagination. Maybe occasionally, we brushed against something real and translated it as best we could into the language of myth. When we look back through the stories that have survived from older cultures, we don't just find vague references to the sea. We find detailed recurring depictions of whole worlds beneath it-inhabited halls, kingdoms, palaces, and beings who move easily where we can barely last a minute. These aren't throwaway details or decorative touches. They sit at the center of myths and legends that mattered deeply to the people who told them, carrying moral lessons, warnings, memories, and identity. They show up so consistently in places so far apart that it becomes harder to dismiss them as pure coincidence. Take the great flood stories. Mesopotamia gave us Utnapishtim and the Epic of Gilgamesh, who survives a world-covering flood with a boat filled with life. The Hebrew tradition tells of Noah and an ark riding above waters that cover even the highest mountains. Indian texts describe Manu, warned by a fish about rising waters, preserving seeds and beings to repopulate the earth. Across the Americas, many indigenous nations recount floods that wiped away earlier worlds before the present one began. These tales are often read as morality narratives. Humanity strays, a deity sends a flood, a chosen survivor carries life forward. But under that shared structure is a simpler, starker image water, rising over homes, fields, and familiar land, erasing what once seemed permanent. Now imagine you were part of a coastal culture facing one of those real events. You survive maybe by retreating inland, maybe by clinging to high ground, maybe by sheer luck. You tell your children what happened. You also tell them about the people who didn't make it. Over generations, those absences cry out for explanation. Did those who vanished simply die? Or did they continue in some other form? Somewhere you can't easily follow? It would feel natural to imagine that the sea didn't just kill them, but took them. That it claimed them into a hidden world below. That what disappeared from your horizon might still be moving in a place you can't see. This theme of transformation of humans or cities becoming something else under the water echoes across cultures. In Greek myths, sea nymphs and nereids live in elaborate undersea palaces, each with their roles and personalities. Poseidon rules from a glowing hall of coral, pearls, and gleaming stone. In Hawaiian tradition, Mo'o are powerful water spirits tied to ponds, streams, and the ocean itself, shapeshifters who can exist both above and below. In Japan, the fisherman Urashima Taro is taken down to Ryugujo, the dragon palace of the sea, where time moves differently. When he returns to the surface, his world has aged centuries. If these were isolated stories from one region, it would be easier to shrug and say, nice metaphor. But they're not. Versions of glowing palaces, time-distorted undersea realms, and water beings that cross between worlds appear in Europe, Asia, the Pacific, and the Americas. Either human imagination keeps reinventing the same set of images, or different cultures were reacting to something they experienced in similar ways. Look closely at the imagery, and certain details stand out. Underwater halls and cities are often described as shimmering, glowing, or filled with unnatural light. Pearls, crystals, gems, luminous stones. These are the metaphors ancient people had for radiance in the dark. Today, we recognize that bioluminescence naturally creates that effect. Fish that flash, corals that glow faintly, jellyfish that pulse like lanterns, bacteria that turn whole waves into lines of fire. Seen from above, or glimpsed briefly below, a cluster of bioluminescent organisms on a reef or seamount could easily give the impression of a city lit from within. Time distortion is another repeated motif. In Urashima Tero's tale, days below equal centuries above. Celtic stories of Tir Fóthán, the land under the wave, describe similar mismatches. Greek and other traditions sometimes show mortals returning from undersea sojourns confused by how the surface world has changed. Part of this is symbolic. Dreams of stepping outside ordinary time are universal. But part of it may also come from the reality of entering an environment without sun or moon. Underwater, especially in caves or deeper layers, you lose the cues that let you track days. Hours blur, minutes stretch. A short stay can feel long. A long stay can feel strangely brief. For people whose survival depends on the sun's rhythm, a place where that rhythm disappears would feel like stepping into another kind of time altogether. Then there are the direct contact stories tales that don't just speak in metaphors of gods and realms, but describe concrete encounters. Fishermen pulled beneath the waves and returned. Travelers lured into undersea feasts. Marriages between humans and sea spirits. Mermaids. Selkies. Naga. Mo'o. Deals made. Gifts exchanged. Children born who don't fully belong to either world. These narratives don't only function as stand-ins for death or dreams. They follow the same structure as cross-cultural encounter stories on land, meeting strangers, navigating difference, sharing or betraying trust. The sea, in these accounts, is not portrayed as an empty volume. It's depicted as populated with hierarchies, customs, rules, and politics of its own. Modern archaeology adds a material layer to these old tales. Off the coast of Dwarka in India, divers have found submerged walls and structures some believe align with scriptural descriptions of an ancient city connected to Krishna. The dating and interpretation are debated, but the presence of human-made stonework under present sea level is not. Around Yonaguni in Japan, those stepped platforms and terraces spark ongoing argument. Did tectonic and erosive forces alone carve such regular forms, or were human efforts involved? In the Mediterranean, pieces of roads, columns, and whole building foundations have been found where coastlines once stood and now lie underwater. Around the world, side-scan sonar and direct dives keep turning up stonework in places where, during low sea level phases, people could easily have lived. We know for certain that many coastal populations of the past were erased or displaced by rising seas. In that sense, stories of drowned cities are grounded in literal events. What remains open is the question of what came next for those people. Did they all die, or flee inland? Or did a few communities attempt to stay in contact with the water as it advanced, even to dwell within it? It's here that the myths of half-human, half-other beings get especially interesting. Mermaids in European lore. Selkie seal people who shed skins to walk on shore. Naga in South and Southeast Asian stories, serpentine water beings with human traits. Mo and other amphibious deities or spirits in Polynesian and Hawaiian traditions. Skeptically, it's easy to say, of course humans invented hybrids to represent the boundary between water and land, but you can also see them as cultural memory of people who lived unusually close to that boundary. We already know of groups like the Bahau and other sea nomads of Southeast Asia who spend most of their lives afloat and underwater. Some have measurable biological adaptations, larger spleens, for instance, that help them dive longer. Project that kind of adaptation farther back in time, under more intense environmental pressure, and the line between unusually aquatic humans and something that feels almost mythic to inland cultures gets thinner. To a farmer miles from the coast, hearing second or third-hand stories of people who slip into the water and stay down far longer than seems possible, who gather food from depths ordinary divers can't reach, who seem more comfortable in waves than on soil. Why wouldn't they become merfolk or naga over a few centuries of retelling? The key pattern is universality. We're not dealing with one isolated myth. We're looking at dozens of cultures spread across oceans and continents, converging on the same motifs. Palaces or cities beneath the waves, light in the deep, time flowing strangely underwater, beings that live in both elements, human contact that is brief, risky, and often transformative. Either human imagination defaults to the same imagery in response to seas, or these cultures were all seeing and feeling something that pushed them along a shared narrative track. Today, we're tempted to demand clear, physical proof. Photos, artifacts, indisputable ruins. Without those, we tend to treat myths as entertainment. But myths are a different kind of evidence. Evidence of what mattered enough to be told and retold, of what events left a deep enough mark to survive as story after the details faded. If entire coastlines full of villages, shrines, and early cities were drowned, myths may be the only surviving witnesses that something once stood where waves now roll. So when we ask, could the first civilization still be alive underwater? These myths stop being background decoration. They become part of the starting data. They're our oldest hints that humans have long suspected we share the planet with others who chose a different route. From here, another question rises almost on its own. Why do we, even now, keep dreaming of entire cities beneath the sea? Why does that image cling to our imagination so stubbornly from Plato to modern movies? As if it's not an invention, but a memory trying to resurface. There's a reason the image of an underwater city refuses to fade. Long after particular myths have blurred, the basic vision remains. Towers under the waves, streets threaded with fish, domes holding back the sea, a quiet glow radiating where sunlight never reaches. Painters return to it. Novelists build sagas around it. Filmmakers turn it into worlds big enough to fill a screen. Even games let us wander those imagined avenues. Ask someone to picture Atlantis, and they usually don't see a shattered ruin. They see a living place. Why? Part of it is that the ocean feels like unfinished space. We've charted continents, flown over mountains, built on plains, and even scattered machines across neighboring planets. The maps make Earth look complete, but the blue on those maps is deceiving. It's not a blank, it's a mask. We sense that. Cities beneath the sea give shape to that masked region. They let us imagine that the unknown is not just empty volume, but rooms, corridors, plazas, inhabited by someone. There's also a psychological inversion at work. On land, our cities dominate. We raise towers to be seen from miles away. We illuminate our streets, send our noise in all directions, and treat visibility as proof of importance. The ocean denies us that. It swallows light. It resists walls. It makes it hard to see more than a few yards in front of you. Imagining a city built into that resistance flips our usual sense of mastery. It suggests that the element we fear and barely manage to visit could be someone else's comfort zone, home ground in the most literal way. Contrast plays a big role as well. Our surface cities are busy, bright, and loud. The way we picture undersea cities, they tend to be the opposite. Hushed, dim, slow. Streets that merge with coral instead of asphalt. Light that breathes like plankton instead of burning like neon. Movement that follows currents instead of forcing a grid upon them. We don't necessarily expect those imagined places to be realistic. What matters is that they embody something we feel missing. Integration with the environment instead of constant struggle against it. Science fiction and fantasy use underwater civilizations as mirrors. In some stories, they're utopias, cultures that learn to live gently within limits, using resources without exhausting them, arranging their lives in harmony with the cycles of the ocean. In others, they're wary or hostile societies, watching us with justified resentment for what we've done to the seas. Both versions reveal our anxieties. The utopias express our wish that someone, somewhere, found a better way. The darker versions express our fear that someone is keeping score. Ancient art hints at similar longings. Roman mosaics showed Neptune in elaborate underwater courts. Asian carvings surrounded rivers and seas with dragons ruling from below. Oral traditions spoke of feasts in hidden halls lit by shell and stone. These weren't casual doodles. They were repeated, structured, and spiritually significant. It doesn't take much first-hand experience with the sea to understand why. If you've ever floated just below the surface and looked up, you know how alien the world above suddenly looks. Trees and buildings distort into wavering shapes. Sunlight fractures into shifting lattices. The sky becomes something you look at from within a different medium. Shallow dives over reefs make the ocean floor feel like a city, already columns of coral, arches of rock, busy streets of fish. Our minds don't have to stretch very far to imagine those impressions pushed a little further into intention. The ocean is also one of the few things left that humbles us regularly. Storms sink ships we thought were unsinkable. Waves redraw coastlines over and over. Tides ignore our schedules. There's a natural urge to tame that fear by imagining that someone has already mastered what we can't. An underwater civilization becomes a symbol of that mastery. If they can thrive there, maybe the ocean isn't pure threat. Maybe it's negotiable. Psychologists sometimes say that when we dream about hidden societies, we're really projecting our own wants and frustrations. When we're unhappy with the systems we built, we imagine someone else has managed better. Underwater cities become vessels for whatever we are longing for. Peace, sustainability, community, wisdom. But it's also possible that something older is feeding into those dreams. Cultural memory. Human brains are surprisingly good at carrying fragments of the past forward in story form. Concrete events become tales, which become myths, which echo as recurring images and archetypes. The persistence of submerged cities in art and narrative may be one of those long echoes, less like pure invention and more like a memory that refuses to go completely quiet. There's another dimension here, boundary crossing. We like to think in terms of limits, habitable versus uninhabitable, ours versus not ours, dry versus wet. When we imagine whole societies living where we currently cannot, we're poking at those lines. We're asking, are these boundaries fixed, or are they just where we've stopped, for now? That question is both unsettling, it threatens our sense of uniqueness, and comforting. It implies resilience. If life can reorganize itself so dramatically in the same world we occupy, then adaptation is more powerful than we tend to assume. Art keeps returning to this theme because confronting it in symbolic form is easier than facing it directly. Films about Atlantis or other undersea realms are, in part, practice runs for what it might feel like if we had to accept that we're not the only ones here. You can see how deep that fascination runs if you watch how children respond. Tell a group of kids about a city in the clouds, and some will shrug. Tell them about cities at the bottom of the ocean, and most will lean in immediately. The ocean already looks magical to them. Animals that glow, whales the size of buses, fish colored like paintings. Add intentional buildings and people, and the picture feels natural, not absurd. Underwater civilizations also double as escape fantasies. Modern life can feel compressed deadlines, alerts, crowds, constant light and noise. An imagined society in the deep promises the opposite. Slowness, quiet, long shadows instead of harsh brightness. Whether or not that promise is realistic is almost beside the point. The fantasy itself offers psychological relief. And yet, those same stories often carry warnings. Not all undersea kingdoms in folklore and fiction are friendly. Some guard their territories fiercely. Some punish intrusion. In those versions, the city beneath the sea stands not as haven, but as judge. That duality refuge and threat tracks neatly with how our ancestors treated sea gods. To be courted, respected, feared. Offerings given not just for blessing, but to avoid wrath. Our modern narratives keep that tension alive. How the undersea people treat us often depends on how we've treated the water. What's most telling is that this imagery hasn't faded with scientific progress. If anything, the more we learn about the deep, the more we seem to want to populate it. Documentaries on hydrothermal vents and deep trenches spark as much sense of wonder as any fantasy film. We hear about tube worms and anglerfish, and we think, if these can exist, what else might be possible? In that sense, our dreams of undersea cities may be doing double duty. They are, at once, speculations about what could physically exist and metaphors for what we wish existed. Other ways of organizing life, other choices made at crucial forks in history. Follow that line of thought far enough, and it eventually confronts you with a harder, more practical question. If such cities are not just dreams, if something like them could or does exist, what would it actually take to build and maintain them in this environment? Not as myth or metaphor, but as physical reality. What pressures, literal and figurative, would have to be met? What inventions, what adaptations, what sacrifices would be required to keep a society alive under the weight and darkness of the deep? When we talk about frontiers, our minds often leap upward or outward peaks we haven't climbed yet. Deserts no one has crossed alone. Distant planets hanging like questions in the night sky. But the largest and most untouched frontier we have isn't past the atmosphere. It touches nearly every shoreline we know. The deep sea is Earth's broadest, least understood realm. And even with all our advances in science and engineering, it remains a place we mostly infer rather than actually visit. We like to tell ourselves that Earth is familiar. Maps show every continent's outline. Satellite images reveal forests, rivers, and cities in crisp detail. We can get from one side of the planet to the other in less than a day. It's easy to believe there are no blank spaces left, but maps can lie by omission. On most of them, the oceans appear as smooth blue shapes. That blankness is not absence. It's ignorance. Strip away the water in your imagination, and you find a world as rugged and dramatic as any fantasy landscape. There are mountain ranges taller than Everest hidden under the waves, trenches deeper than anything on land, vast ridges that stretch farther than any highway network we've ever built, threading like scars across the seafloor. 19th century explorers dragged weighted lines over the side of ships to guess at depths. Even then, they ran into sheer drops they couldn't properly measure. Today, we bounce sonar off the bottom and watch satellite readings of the sea's surface to infer what lies below. But much of what we have are approximations, a fingertip tracing a blanket while trying to guess the furniture beneath. The scale of the deep is part of why it stays unknown. More than 2/3 of our planet's surface is under ocean. Average depth, around 4 kilometers. Maximum, more than 10. If we could drain it all, the exposed terrain would dwarf the familiar continents in both variety and extent. To really explore it, every canyon, every vent, every slope would take generations, even with fleets of sophisticated machines. And yet, for all that inaccessibility, the deep isn't barren. Wherever we've managed to look closely, we find life. Around hydrothermal vents, superheated, mineral-rich water gushes from the crust, and entire ecosystems feed not on sunlight, but on chemical energy. In the open dark, creatures flash with bioluminescence, hunt with lanterns, or drift like ghosts, adapted to pressure that would crush most submarines. Some of them live extremely long lives, growing slowly in the cold. Each expedition that pushes a little deeper returns with species we've never seen before. That's not an exaggeration, it's routine, which should make us cautious about declaring anything impossible down there. That's why calling the deep sea Earth's final frontier isn't just poetic. It's accurate. It is the largest volume of unexplored space we have, wrapped directly around the world we think we know. And that's where the question of a hidden civilization becomes sharper, not softer. If this immense domain can hide mountain ranges, volcanoes, trenches, and entire webs of life from us, why do we assume it couldn't conceal something organized and intelligent? The fact that it's extremely hard for us to operate there doesn't mean it's inhospitable to everything only, that it's inhospitable to creatures and machines designed for air and low pressure. We often compare deep ocean exploration to spaceflight. Both environments are dangerous, both require life support, both are expensive to reach. But there's one crucial difference: distance. The deep sea begins steps from our beaches. It's not millions of miles away. It's lapping at our coasts. If a non-human civilization were going to share this planet with us quietly and continuously, the highest odds are not out there among the stars, but down there, under our hulls. The obstacles are real. Pressure rises by 1 atmosphere every 10 meters. At 1,000 meters, every square inch experiences 100 times the pressure we feel at the surface. Human bodies are not built for that. Our lungs, sinuses, and blood chemistry revolt quickly. Submarines must be designed like steel eggshells, carefully balanced between strength and weight. Only a handful of human-made vessels have ever touched the deepest trenches, and each visit was brief. Consider that against centuries of traversing and settling land, and you realize how little time we physically spent in that part of our own world. The deep also defies our tidy ecological maps. On land, we draw lines: forest, grassland, desert, tundra. In the ocean, boundaries are shaped by gradients, temperature, salt, light, pressure sliding into each other. Currents blur edges constantly. It's an environment in motion. Any society that lives there would have to be comfortable with fluidity in every sense. We, on the other hand, look for permanence: stone foundations, fixed cities, long straight roads. It's entirely possible we've looked directly past evidence of intelligent adaptation under the sea because we're only trained to recognize our own style of making. Imagine an architecture built to flex instead of resist, to blend instead of stand apart. Structures grown out of coral and living rock rather than poured concrete. Homes that move slowly with currents instead of sitting rooted in one place. To our remote cameras, such places would look like ordinary reefs and ridges. This is where the concept of the deep sea as frontier overlaps with something more subtle: projection. We pour our need for mystery into that space. When we imagine cities beneath the sea, we're not only speculating about physics and biology, we're also saying that we want the world to still have unknown corners. We don't want the story of discovery to be finished, but frontiers don't remain frontiers forever. Technology pushes forward. Sonar resolution improves. Autonomous vehicles dive deeper and longer. Each new survey chips a tiny piece off the unknown. If intelligent life exists in our oceans, hiding may become more difficult over time. But it also has a head start. It's had millennia to observe us, adapt to us, and learn how to avoid the frequencies, depths, and regions we most often disturb. From their viewpoint, if they exist, we are the explorers blundering into their home late in the story, not the other way around. Thinking this way shifts our question slightly. Instead of asking, "Is an underwater civilization possible?" we start to ask, given what evolution and culture can do, why would it be impossible? Life has shown over and over that it will exploit any energy gradient it can reach: sunlight, chemical vents, decaying organic matter. It has colonized boiling springs and frozen lakes, acidic pools, and irradiated waste. Intelligence, too, has arisen at least once in a complex technological form ours, and arguably in different modes in whales, cephalopods, and others. So if you give biology a realm the size of the global ocean, with millions of years to work and many different niches to explore, it's not unthinkable that something there might have taken a path toward complex culture earlier or differently than we did. All of this makes the deep sea feel less like a static backdrop and more like a dynamic, contested, storied place. A place where something could be happening right now that we've barely imagined. Which brings us to a much more immediate challenge. Not whether consciousness and complexity could arise there, but how any air-breathing creature like us could possibly join it. What would it take, in purely practical terms, to live not just beside the ocean, but inside it, year after year, generation after generation? Before we talk about cities or histories, we have to talk about the first, simplest barrier: breath. The most basic problem with living underwater is brutally simple. We can't breathe there. Human lungs are designed for air-thin, compressible, rich with oxygen. Water is dense, heavy, and our respiratory system can't pull dissolved oxygen from it. We can hold our breath. We can bring our own air in tanks. But unaided, The ocean is not our medium. So if we want to seriously imagine a civilization that has lived below the surface for thousands of years, we need to think carefully about how they solved that. Did they change their bodies? Or did they build tools and systems that made the water livable without radical biological shifts? Or most likely some combination of both? Biology already offers us prototypes for what's possible. Fish use gills' delicate, high surface area structures that strip oxygen directly from water. Whales and dolphins, like us, are mammals. They still need air, but they've evolved ways to store and use it far more efficiently. Seals can slow their heart rates, shunt blood away from extremities, and tolerate carbon dioxide buildup to stay down longer. Some turtles can hibernate underwater for months, surviving on minimal oxygen. Even humans carry traces of aquatic adaptation. We have a mammalian dive reflex. When our faces are submerged in cool water, heart rate drops, blood flow shifts to protect vital organs, and the body begins to conserve oxygen. It's faint compared to sea mammals, but it's there. Certain human populations show stronger adaptations. The Bajau and related sea nomad groups of Southeast Asia spend so much of their lives diving that evolution has nudged their physiology. Studies suggest they have larger spleens, which act as oxygen reservoirs by storing red blood cells. They can stay underwater minutes at a time with remarkable ease. That's in just a few thousand years under relatively modest pressure. Give evolution more time and harsher selective forces, and greater changes become possible. If coastal people were forced by rapid sea level rise to spend more and more of their time diving for food, shelter, and safety, those best suited to underwater life might survive at higher rates. Over many generations, traits that support longer breath holding, better tolerance for pressure, and more efficient oxygen use could accumulate. Maybe they never developed full gills, but they might have. Larger spleens and blood volumes, higher concentrations of oxygen-binding molecules, more flexible rib cages and lungs, stronger dive reflexes and slower resting metabolisms. The result would be humans, or human-like beings, who can stay submerged for much longer stretches, needing air only occasionally. Biology alone, though, might not be enough. Technology, in a broad sense, would likely join the effort early. When we say technology, we tend to picture metal and engines. But the earliest technologies are always simpler, using the shapes and properties of the environment itself. Imagine early coastal people discovering partially submerged caves where air collects in trapped pockets, diving down, surfacing in those bubbles, realizing they can rest and breathe there before going back out. Over time, they might reinforce such spaces, or learn to create artificial structures that trap air under ledges or in woven frames, crude but effective refuges. Plants could play a role too. Some aquatic vegetation releases oxygen into nearby water. Perhaps they noticed fish clustering around certain plants and built shelters near them. Or maybe they learned to cultivate surfaces with algae and other organisms that assist in maintaining a thin, usable layer of improved water, or occasional air. Even today, engineers have experimented with artificial gills, devices that attempt to pull oxygen out of water and feed it to human lungs. Our current attempts are limited, but the concept itself isn't fantasy. It's chemistry and surface area. A civilization with millennia of practice in ocean conditions could potentially refine such ideas far beyond our prototypes. Hybrid solutions are especially plausible. Partial biological adaptation supported by clever environmental engineering. Think of how we use clothing, housing, and tools. Our bodies are not built for cold or heat extremes, yet we've extended our habitable range dramatically through relatively simple means. An underwater civilization could have done the same, but with shells, stone, coral, and carefully designed spaces. Pressure is another huge issue. Our lungs, full of air, are vulnerable to collapse at depth. Nitrogen dissolving into our blood at high pressure and then bubbling out on ascent causes decompression sickness. If an underwater people wanted to live mostly at depth, they'd likely evolve or engineer bodies and practices that minimize those problems. That might mean reducing or eliminating large internal air spaces, keeping to certain depth ranges most of the time, moving between depths slowly, following natural decompression paths, developing circulatory systems that tolerate pressure shifts better than ours. It's also conceivable that some lineages might diverge farther from our formless air-reliant, more fluid-filled. But even without that, careful management of movement and habitat could go a long way. We shouldn't forget that breathing, in the way we mean it, isn't the only way to run metabolism. Some organisms in extreme environments rely on very slow, low-energy lifestyles. They move little, live long, and need less. An intelligent species could deliberately build a culture around reduced metabolic demand. Long periods of rest or torpor between active phases, entire social rhythms shaped around conserving oxygen. If they also tapped energy sources like hydrothermal vents, using chemistry instead of sunlight, they could anchor themselves in places where both food and warmth are reliable, further reducing the need for constant movement. There's also the question of whether they descended from humans at all. If they branched off from a pre-human ancestor much earlier, they might have taken a completely different structural path, organs and tissues optimized for water from the start. In that case, comparing their breathing to ours might be like comparing plant photosynthesis to animal respiration, related at a deep biochemical level, but very different in form. However they solved it, through evolved bodies, crafted spaces, symbiosis with other organisms, or all of the above breath in their world, would never be casual. For us, breathing is so automatic we barely notice it. For them, every inhalation, whether of air in pockets or oxygen-permeated water, might be a conscious, culturally loaded act. Imagine a culture where taking a breath at a shared air pocket is a social ritual. Wasting air is a grave offense. Children are taught from birth to see oxygen as sacred. Songs, ceremonies, and laws revolve around how and when communities surface. Breath could become central to belief systems. We already treat breath as spiritual metaphor, spiritus, pneuma, the breath of life. In their environment, that metaphor and physical reality would be tightly fused. This also shifts how we think about hybrid beings in myths, mermaids, selkies, naga. These may be imaginative ways of grappling with the idea of people who straddle two modes of life, comfortable enough in water to seem part of it, but still tied to air in ways that inland observers don't fully grasp. Looking ahead, we can even use this as a mirror for ourselves. As climate change raises sea levels and crowds coasts, humans have started to talk seriously about floating cities, seasteads, even long-term underwater habitats. Engineers sketch domes on the seabed and towers half submerged. If we pursue that path, we'll face the same questions. Do we alter our bodies to suit the ocean? Or do we build shells to carry our terrestrial biology down with us? Genetic engineering is making the first option more conceivable. Materials science and robotics support the second. It's not hard to imagine a future where our descendants become, in a small way, like the beings we've been speculating about, amphibious in culture, if not in flesh. If that happens, we might find ourselves telling stories about those early pioneers of the deep in the same tone we now use about mythical sea people. For an ancient underwater civilization, breath would be both the same and different from ours. The same because it's about oxygen and survival. Different because the environment forces explicit awareness and collective management. In that sense, the line between biology and technology blurs. Lungs, gills, air pockets, artificial membranes, algae farms, if they all serve the same purpose, the distinction becomes more about where they reside than what they are. And once the basic barrier of breathing is overcome, other questions rush in. How do you build in such a place? What does a city look like when gravity, pressure, and currents all play by different rules? What counts as a wall, a roof, a road, when your world is three-dimensional and always in motion? To answer those, we have to let our idea of architecture dissolve and reform underwater. The word Atlantis has become so ordinary in our language that we barely hear how strange it is anymore. It stands in for any vanished civilization, any lost golden age, any body of knowledge we suspect once existed and then slipped away. But when Plato first wrote the story down, He wasn't trying to craft a fantasy novel. He treated Atlantis as a historical example, a cautionary tale woven into philosophy. He placed it beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, on an island larger than Libya and Asia combined. There, he said, lived a powerful, organized people with advanced engineering, ordered government, and a navy strong enough to challenge the early Greeks. In Plato's telling, Atlantis prospered, grew arrogant, offended the gods, and was submerged in a single day and night of catastrophe. Scholars have argued ever since about what he meant. Some insist he invented the whole story as a moral and political parable. Others believe he may have distilled rumors of real disasters, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, coastal floods, into a single dramatic narrative. A few suggest he was preserving a dim echo of much older events. Whatever its origin, the fact that Atlantis gripped imagination so fiercely tells us that people were already ripe for that kind of story. The soil was prepared. A great civilization swallowed by the sea didn't feel absurd. It felt possible. From there, Atlantis multiplied. Medieval mapmakers placed it in the Atlantic. Early modern explorers sailed west, half expecting to find its remnants. In the 19th century, speculative writers used it to explain similarities between distant cultures, proposing Atlantis as a common ancestor to Egyptian, Mayan, and other achievements. Later mystics and occultists recast it as a spiritually advanced society whose downfall marked humanity's fall from some earlier, purer state. Each retelling said at least as much about its own time as about any ancient truth. Atlantis became a mirror. If you wanted a warning against pride, it was a moral tragedy. If you wanted to believe in a forgotten age of wisdom, it was proof. If you wanted a unifying explanation for scattered ruins, it became a convenient missing piece. But when you pull back from the specific name, you see a larger pattern. Atlantis is only one node in a network of drowned world legends. Indian epics speak of Dvaraka, Krishna's city by the sea, eventually reclaimed by the ocean. Off modern Dwarka, divers have indeed found submerged walls and structures, still actively studied and debated. Celtic lore remembers Lyonesse, a land said to stretch between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly before it sank, leaving only scattered rocks and tales. Welsh tradition keeps the story of Cantre'r Gwaelod, a fertile kingdom lost when floodgates were left open or failed in a storm. Japan has Urashima Taro and the Dragon Palace beneath the waves. Norse cosmology places the serpent Jörmungandr in the depths, coiled around the world, embodying the ocean's encircling threat and mystery. Polynesian stories talk of islands that once stood high and are now gone, or of kingdoms visible below the surface on exceptionally clear days. Across the Americas, flood, and world before this world, stories mention lands and peoples washed away. In all of them, you can hear the same refrain. Cities thriving, then taken. Land once known, now underwater. People gone from sight, but not entirely erased from memory. Some of this we can tie directly to geology. We know from sea level reconstructions that coastlines have moved dramatically since the last ice age. We know that earthquakes and volcanic eruptions can cause sudden subsidence. The eruption of Thera, Santorini, for example, devastated Minoan settlements. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami gave our own age a brutal example of how quickly water can undo human work. Those physical events offer a grounding for myths about lands swallowed by the sea. But myth rarely stops at simple retelling. Once a city is gone, imagination rushes in to ask, what became of it? People don't like hard endings. It's easier in some ways to picture the city continuing invisibly below than to accept pure annihilation. That's where Atlantis and its cousins become echoes instead of just metaphors. They're the shapes taken by a persistent question. Did everything end there? Or did some part of that world go on, unseen? We occasionally find physical hints that keep the question open. Divers discover steps and terraces where geology alone doesn't provide an easy explanation. Sonar reveals long, straight lines or rectilinear patterns under layers of silt. Artifacts for which we have no confident context show up far from where we'd expect them. Often, further study shows these to be natural formations or misinterpretations. Sometimes the data remains inconclusive. Science, properly cautious, shrugs and files them under unresolved. But each case adds a little fuel to the old stories. The deeper point is that Atlantis might not be a single place at all. Instead of one magnificent city erased in a night, we might be looking at the fictionalized sum of many real drownings. Dozens or hundreds of coastal settlements, villages, towns, proto-cities were flooded as ice retreated. Each left surviving witnesses. Each spawned its own local tale of loss. Over centuries of trade and cultural mixing, those tales could have merged into broader myths of the land beneath the sea. Atlantis, Lyonesse, Dvaraka, Kentra Gwelod, these may be not rivals for the title of true lost city, but regional names for a single global experience, the sea advancing over what people once thought was permanent ground. In that sense, they're less about one vanished metropolis and more about a long, uneven negotiation between humans and a moving shoreline. Yet they're also about something else. They carry an intuition that not everything ended at the waveline. They whisper that some thread continued in the depths. Today, when we say Atlantis, we usually mean mystery itself, a placeholder for everything we suspect we're missing. In that way, the legend has outgrown its specifics and become a symbol. It reminds us that the ocean is not just a place where things are erased, it's a place where they can be hidden. When you stand on a coast now and hear that name, you're not just invoking Plato's story. You're tapping into a much older collective hunch that the sea has been keeping secrets for a very long time. If any of those secrets involve not just broken stones but living cultures, then Atlantis is less a relic of the past and more a question mark hanging over the present. And if we follow that question down, the next thing we have to imagine is not just the existence of such a civilization, but the way it would physically inhabit its world. We have to stop picturing marble columns transplanted underwater and start asking, what does architecture look like when it's designed for pressure, darkness, and current instead of for gravity, weather, and open air? When we hear the word architecture, most of us picture the same familiar palette. Walls pushing back against wind and rain, roofs shedding storms, foundations dug into unmoving ground. Our buildings are sculptures set into gravity, designed to stand up under their own weight and resist whatever the sky throws down. Underwater, almost every one of those assumptions dissolves. The deep ocean doesn't press from above in the same way. It presses from all directions at once. It doesn't offer clear, dry ground. It offers a constantly shifting, three-dimensional fluid. Light doesn't stream in most of the time. It doesn't arrive at all. Vision stops being the primary sense. Sound, pressure, current, and darkness step in. So if a civilization has grown there, their architecture, their way of shaping space, would not resemble ours with a few tweaks. It would be something else entirely. Start with gravity. On land, weight is a constant problem. Stacked stone wants to fall. Towers must be buttressed. Beams must be thick enough to bear loads. Much of what we call engineering is just a long negotiation with downward pull. In water, buoyancy lightens the load. A heavy stone that would crush supports on land can hang almost weightless if it's neutrally buoyant. Structures don't have to push down as hard. They can float, be tethered, or be lightly anchored instead of massively rooted. An underwater city might not rise much. It could spread horizontally along cliffs, shelves, and ridges. Imagine clusters of habitats attached like barnacles to seamounts, or like swallows' nests along a canyon wall. Then comes pressure. At depth, the immense weight of water squeezes everything. Flat surfaces and empty spaces bear that load poorly. Hollow, air-filled cavities implode unless engineered with extreme care. Nature has already solved this issue. Creatures that live deep often have flexible, compressible bodies, few or no rigid air spaces, rounded, curved shapes that distribute force evenly. An underwater civilization would likely mirror those rules in its architecture. Spheres and domes withstand pressure better than cubes. Shell-like forms and arches resist crushing far better than flat walls and angles. Think of shell domes grown or carved to sit snugly against rock. Bubble-like chambers reinforced from within. Nested layered enclosures that flex slightly instead of cracking. Material choice shifts too. Our typical pallet wood, unsealed metal, porous masonry decays quickly in seawater. Salt corrodes. Biofouling covers surfaces. Hard edges soften. But coral thrives. So does volcanic rock. So do certain shells, sponges, and algae. It's plausible that underwater buildings wouldn't just be built, they'd be grown. Coral can be guided. We already practice coral gardening, shaping reefs for restoration. Kelp can be farmed and woven into strong, flexible mats. Volcanic chimneys around vents rise as mineral columns. An underwater people might seed coral along frames to form thick, living walls. Encourage sponge and shell growth where cushioning or filtration is needed. Carve and hollow volcanic pillars into habitable cores. Use kelp and other plants as tensile structures, screens, and anchors. From a distance, these would look like natural reefs and outcrops, part of the seafloor. Only to trained eyes would patterns emerge: regular spacing, unusual symmetries, purposeful gaps in corridors. That raises an important point. We might already be swimming past such engineering without recognizing it. Our default assumption is that anything that looks organic must be natural, but a civilization integrated with its environment might prize that invisibility. Mobility is another likely trait. Our cities are fixed. Streets rarely move. Buildings stay where they are unless torn down. But in a medium of ever-shifting currents, tectonics, and sediment flows, permanence could be dangerous. It may be safer to design with movement in mind. Habitats that can detach and drift short distances. Clusters that migrate slowly along a ridge or current over generations. Tethered structures that ride out violent disturbances by flexing, not resisting. Picture a city not as a map of fixed blocks, but as a cloud of loosely connected elements adjusting depth, spacing, and orientation as the environment demands. Orientation itself changes. We orient our world on a flat plane with up and down as simple opposites. In the ocean, up and down are gradients of pressure and light. Travel happens in all three dimensions freely. Paths aren't just left and right, they're layers. A truly underwater city might be volumetric, stacked habitats at different depths, connected by vertical thoroughfares as much as horizontal ones. Communities might specialize by depth band, shallower groups close to light and algae, deeper ones near vents or stable cold. Our idea of street plans would be replaced by chains of resonant chambers aligned vertically, spiral routes ascending and descending along pinnacles, sound corridors carved to guide navigation instead of visual roads. Light reshapes architecture too. No sun reaches the deep. Illumination becomes something you generate, grow, or release selectively. Bioluminescent organisms are an obvious tool. A civilization might cultivate walls seeded with glowing bacteria for soft, constant light, roofs covered in algae that glimmer faintly when touched, signaling patterns, pulses of brightness that mark routes and entrances. Homes might be recognized less by their outline and more by their unique light signatures, slow-changing patterns that function like addresses or family crests. Sound is equally important. Underwater, sound travels far, and structures can be tuned to interact with it. Architecture might be designed for acoustics as much as for shelter. Consider huge, hollow columns that hum at specific frequencies when currents pass through. Chamber arrangements that focus certain tones and cancel others. Meeting halls, where even a soft click resonates clearly across the space. Entire districts could be organized by sound profile areas that ring with low communal vibrations, quiet sanctuaries tuned to muffle noise, signal corridors that act like audio highways. From our perspective, with limited visits and different priorities, we might mistake all of this for background geology or biology. We're not trained to think of reefs and ridges as potential buildings. Scale also matters. Our largest cities cover thousands of square kilometers and hold millions of people. Underwater, it might be more efficient and safer to think small and distributed. Many modest clusters rather than one massive hub. Communities spread thinly along food and energy sources. Networks linked by sound, migration, and ritual rather than by infrastructure corridors. This would leave no grand Atlantis for us to stumble across, only a web of subtle, durable adaptations scattered through the deep. Even the concept of indoors and outdoors shifts. On land, walls protect us from weather. Underwater, temperature and pressure are relatively stable once a depth is chosen. Protection might mean shielding from currents, predators, or abrasive sediment more than from elements, as we think of them. So their shelters might be flow shadow zones where currents are slowed, cavities where pressure equalization or air pockets are managed, resonance-controlled volumes used for communication, and rest monuments. Our most enduring architectural gestures would likely be different too. Stone obelisks and statues don't last unchanged in that environment. Perhaps their monuments are vast, choreographed light displays written into living organisms, long-lasting soundscapes generated by natural features slightly reshaped, sacred vent fields tended for centuries, their stability itself the monument. All of this adds up to a picture of architecture that is so tightly woven into ocean processes that we, from outside, might never notice it at all. If you accept that, a further question emerges. In a world where light is rare and pressure is constant, how do such people experience day, night, and time itself? How does a city or a village or a drifting cluster organize its rhythms in a place where the sun never rises? That leads us to think not just about structures, but about the deeper forces that define their lives: darkness, pressure, food, and energy. On the surface, light is our first and deepest clock. Sunrise and sunset tell us when to wake and when to rest. Seasons, shadows, and color shifts all flow from the sun's movement. We've tied our calendars, rituals, and even moods to that cycle for as long as we've been telling time. Beneath the sea, especially beyond a few hundred meters, those cues disappear. Day and night blur into one long, steady dark. There is no dawn, no dusk, no visible arc of the sun to measure life against. So if a civilization lives there, light and darkness can't mean what they mean to us. They would be something entirely different. In their world, light would be rare, deliberate, and often alive. Bioluminescence would probably be the most important source of illumination. Creatures that glow bacteria, plankton, jellyfish, squid, fish, already turned stretches of the ocean into moving constellations. A society adapted to that world might cultivate and choreograph those lights. Imagine homes outlined by fields of dim, cultivated glow, paths marked by strings of organisms pulsing in slow sequences, family or clan patterns represented as unique flickering signatures, like living sigils. Light would be less about banishing darkness and more about marking identity, territory, ritual. Darkness, in turn, wouldn't be a symbol of fear or ignorance. It would be baseline reality, a comfort, a protection. Too much light might be overwhelming or even dangerous, revealing locations to predators or unwanted visitors. So illumination could be rationed and meaningful, reserved for shared events, travel, or specific work. Their perception would adapt accordingly. Where we rely heavily on vision, they'd lean into extremely sensitive low-light eyes, if they have eyes at all. Lateral line-like systems to feel water movement. Acute hearing for subtle shifts in background sound. A mental map built from echoes and pressure gradients rather than from clear visual outlines. In such a world, art and communication could become performances of light and shadow. Instead of paintings on walls, they might stage slow, synchronized bioluminescent displays, entire groups pulsing and dimming together in patterns that tell stories or honor events. What looks to us like a swirling school of glowing animals could, to them, be a carefully arranged narrative or celebration. Darkness itself would gain layers of meaning. Shallow darkness, where faint hints of surface light still filter in. Mid-depth darkness, with occasional flashes from creatures and communities. True abyssal darkness, where nothing shines unless someone chooses to make it do so. Living mostly without sunlight would also reshape how they think about time. Without sunrise and sunset, they might measure time by the periodic return of certain currents, cycles of marine snow thickening and thinning, seasonal changes in the abundance of particular species, rhythms of distant storms translated into pressure and sound at depth. Morning for them might be when a food-bearing current arrives. Evening, when it slackens. Their year might be the full cycle of a current loop or a pattern in surface productivity that echoes downwards. Darkness could also become sacred. Where our religions often associate God or truth with light, theirs might find the divine in depth and shadow, the unseen, the enveloping, the endless medium that holds everything. Light might be seen as a temporary blossom within a larger, necessary dark. From the outside, we tend to treat darkness as empty. For them, it would be full of pressure, of water, of potential. That shift in baseline perception would ripple through their philosophy, ethics, and sense of self. We can't separate darkness from its twin, though, pressure. On land, we don't feel the weight of the air around us consciously. At sea level, it's just normal. But dive into the ocean, and every 10 meters adds another atmosphere of force. At great depths, that invisible weight becomes almost unimaginable to us. Submarines creak, metal deforms, and the human body quickly reaches its limits. For a deep-dwelling civilization, though, that same pressure would be as ordinary as our one atmosphere is to us. It would be the shape of comfort, not threat. Their bodies and any structures they build would be tuned to this constant embrace. Flexible enough to compress, dense enough to resist being crushed, few or no air-filled cavities to implode. Pressure would be, in a very real sense, their ground, the stable condition they know, the baseline against which everything else is measured. That changes more than physiology. It changes psychology. Where we use pressure as a metaphor for stress, burden, or expectation, they might associate it with safety. To be under proper pressure could mean to be at home. Ascending toward the surface, where the weight lessens, might feel exposed, thin, wrong, as if something essential is missing. Imagine how that inversion would shape their myths, creation stories where the world began weightless and chaotic, then became habitable as pressure increased. Rites of passage, journeys into greater depth and pressure as a sign of maturity or courage. Boundaries, communities identified by depth zones rather than by borders on a surface. Communication and technology would interweave with pressure too. Sound behaves differently at higher pressures and varying temperatures. An underwater people would intuitively understand how to send vibrations through this medium, maybe even using pressure gradients to guide and bend signals. They could harness pressure differences as energy sources, the way we harness water falling through turbines. For instance, systems that use ascending and descending chambers to generate power. Structures that exploit tiny but reliable pressure shifts from tides or currents. Their sense of vertical stratification, different life and culture bands at different depths, would make the ocean feel more like a layered world than a uniform one. What we call the deep, as a single concept might, to them, be as differentiated as continents are to us. From that perspective, our environment would feel extreme. To them, surfacing into low pressure and bright light might be akin to us visiting high altitudes without acclimatization. Short trips maybe, long stays, dangerous. Even if direct contact happened, it would likely be in liminal zones where both sides are on the edge of what they can tolerate. Back under that familiar pressure and darkness, survival depends on two other pillars: food and energy. On land, we solve those through agriculture and fire. Under the sea, especially in the deep, those solutions aren't available in the same way. There are no open fields to till. Fire cannot burn in surrounding water. Sunlight barely penetrates. Yet life thrives there. It eats and powers itself with resources most surface dwellers never see. A civilization would have to tap into those same systems. One primary food source is the constant fall of organic debris called marine snow, a gentle, endless drift of tiny particles, dead plankton, fecal matter, fragments of flesh and plant. It's not glamorous, but it's dependable. A deep society might build or grow structures designed to catch and concentrate marine snow. Farm filter feeders like sponges, bivalves, and corals that naturally harvest these particles. Develop methods to store and redistribute this captured nutrition the way we store grain. Around hydrothermal vents and cold seeps, chemosynthetic ecosystems form without sunlight. Microbes use chemicals like hydrogen sulfide or methane as energy sources. Larger organisms feed on those microbes or on each other. These are oases in the abyss. An underwater civilization could treat vents like we treat fertile river valleys, protecting them as critical food and energy sources, cultivating particular species that thrive there, engineering the flow of vent fluids to stabilize or expand habitable zones. For plant-like foods, shallower regions offer kelp forests and seaweed beds. Early stages of an underwater culture might have clung to those, cultivating and selectively breeding seaweeds for nutrition and structural use. As they move deeper, they might bring descendants of those crops with them, paired with bioluminescent partners or chemical processes to sustain them in lower light. Protein would be abundant but not trivial to catch sustainably. Free access to fish and invertebrates would require restraint. Over-harvesting local stocks could quickly become deadly. That pressure might push them toward highly regulated hunting traditions, fish, herding, or cultivation, the underwater equivalent of pastoralism, symbiotic relationships with certain animals, guiding, guarding, or trading services. Energy, in the absence of fire, might come from currents driving flexible turbines or wave-like generators. Thermal gradients near vents exploited with simple heat exchange systems. Chemical energy from vent fluids or seeps used directly or brokered through engineered organisms. We already draw inspiration from these ideas for future human tech ocean thermal energy conversion, biobatteries, microbial fuel cells. A society that grew up in those conditions would likely be far ahead in such designs. Cold water is a natural refrigerator. Deep, stable temperatures could slow decay, making storage easier. Food caches in cold pockets or caves. Pressure-sealed chambers using sediment and rock as insulation. Community storehouses guarded not by locks, but by geography and custom scarcity, and risk would shape culture. With no guarantee of next season's crop or hunt, wasting food or energy would be one of the gravest sins. Sharing and cooperation would be more than moral ideals. They'd be practical necessities. A hoarder might endanger everyone. Feasts, if they happened, would be intensely significant, marking rare surpluses or crucial turning points in cycles. Rituals might track the arrival of rich currents or the flare of particularly productive vents. The tools used to gather and manage food would be very different from ours. Less about sharp edges and combustion, more about shapes that nudge currents, calm waters, attract or guide animals, cultivate microbes. In a sense, their primary farms, power stations, and cities would all be built into and around the same features. Vents, seamounts, trench walls, rich upwelling zones. Life, sustenance, and structure would co-locate. And beyond the material challenges lies perhaps the most fragile bridge of all: contact. Even if they exist, hidden in darkness, shaped by pressure, sustained by snow and chemical flame, could we ever truly meet them? And if we did, what would that meeting mean? For them and for us. To approach that, we have to think about communication, not just as a technical problem, but as a negotiation between two utterly different experiences of time, risk, and meaning. When we imagine finally meeting a civilization beneath the sea, it's easy to picture the cinematic version: bright lights, shared symbols, a moment of instant recognition. In reality, any contact would almost certainly be hesitant, fragmented, and brief. Even if we happened to be in the same place at the same time, we'd be separated by 3 enormous gaps: environment, language, and trust. We've already touched on environment. Our bodies are tuned to air and low pressure. Theirs, if they live in the deep, would be tuned to water and crushing weight. That means any meeting zone would be a liminal, compromised space. Shallow enough that we can reach with gear, deep enough that they can tolerate lower pressure, at least for a short time. Think of narrow bands of depth along continental shelves and slopes. Encounters there would be under strict constraints of time and physiology. No leisurely conversations, more like brief crossings at a contested border. Then comes language, in the broadest sense. Their communication might be built from pulses, tones, and patterns of light and movement dense, multi-layered, and tied to environmental cues we don't register. Our first attempts would be clumsy, relying on repetition, simple, repeated sounds or flashes. Imitation, copying any patterns we observe them using. Mapping, trying to link specific signals to observable actions. This is, roughly, how we've approached animal communication. We build catalogs of sounds, look for structure, test responses. Progress is slow, and misunderstandings are constant even with species we can physically handle and observe up close. With an underwater civilization actively choosing how much to reveal, the process would be even more delicate. Trust is the third barrier, and maybe the highest. From their perspective, our record is not encouraging. Wherever humans have expanded, we've tended to exploit resources first, ask questions later, treat other cultures as subjects of study or control, prioritize short-term gain over long-term stability. They would have watched our ships grow larger and louder, seen the spread of pollution, felt the shock waves of explosions. They might have witnessed whales and other beings they respect harmed by our actions. So, if they exist and are aware of us, they would likely start from caution, not curiosity. From our side, the reactions would be just as conflicted. Some would feel awe and hope, finally proof we are not the only intelligent culture here. Others would feel threatened, afraid of losing control over oceans and resources. Governments would scramble to assess risk and advantage. Religions would interpret through their own frameworks. Science would surge forward, hungry for data. Under such pressure, the risk of missteps would be high. We've seen this pattern many times in our own history. When previously isolated human cultures meet suddenly, the smaller or less powerful one is almost always harmed. Disease, exploitation, cultural erasure. The parallels are uncomfortable. An underwater civilization might know this pattern well from watching us or from their own history. They might be determined to avoid replaying it. So it's entirely plausible that if contact ever happens, it will be on their terms, not ours. At times of their choosing. In places they can retreat from, easily. With layers of misdirection and protection, they might start by observing more closely, testing our reactions, approaching small, unarmed research subs, sending simple, repeating light or sound patterns, watching how we respond. Do we attack, flee, attempt to copy, or remain oblivious? If they see aggression or recklessness, they'll likely withdraw further. If they see patience and listening, maybe they'll risk a little more. It's also possible that contact has already happened in subtle or isolated ways. Stories of divers seeing figures in the gloom, of strange lights following ships, of inexplicable rescue in storms. These may be fabrications, misunderstandings, or psychological effects. But if real encounters are rare, brief, and shocking, this is exactly the kind of evidence we'd expect. Scattered, hard to verify, easily dismissed. Technology complicates all of this. Our growing ability to send drones, map with finer sonar, and monitor sound at global scales makes inadvertent discovery more likely. From their side, if they're technologically sophisticated, they could disrupt or camouflage many of those attempts, spoofing signals, diverting probes, influencing what we see. Imagine, sonar returns subtly altered to hide structures, acoustic sensors flooded with natural-seeming noise, cameras fogged, blocked, or gently turned away. To us, these would look like technical glitches or natural interference. To them, they'd be standard security measures. If contact ever becomes sustained, the stakes are enormous for both sides. For us, it would be the first time we confront an intelligent other on Earth, whose history, environment, and perception of reality are radically different. It would challenge our sense of uniqueness, force us to reconsider human-centered ethics, expose biases in our science and philosophy. For them, it would mean exposing a long-hidden existence to a loud, unpredictable neighbor. They'd have to weigh any benefits sharing knowledge, gaining allies, influencing our behavior against profound risks. That's why it's not obvious that meeting is inevitable, even if both sides are capable. They might decide that the best relationship is no open relationship at all, parallel lives, minimal interference, and yet the pull of curiosity could act on them as strongly as it acts on us. We know how hard it is for humans to resist investigating the unknown. We send machines to the edge of the solar system for no practical gain, just to know. Perhaps an underwater civilization feels that same urge. Perhaps they want to understand these noisy beings on the surface who build strange structures and light up the coasts. If so, the earliest bridge between us would probably not be sophisticated dialogue. It would be shared rhythm. Simple, repeating sequences of sound or light are universal. We already use them in trying to communicate with other species and even with hypothetical extraterrestrials. A triple pulse, pause, triple pulse pattern carries an obvious intentionality. Music, in particular, may have advantages over language as a first contact tool. It doesn't require shared grammar. It relies on pattern recognition, which many intelligent animals already show. It can be layered, allowing exchange even if full translation is impossible. Imagine a scenario where we send a sequence of tones into the water, then pause. Something answers, not with noise, but with a clearly structured variation. Over time, call and response grows more elaborate. That kind of interaction could happen even without direct physical proximity. Hydrophones, speakers, and even existing military and scientific networks could carry it. But such exchanges would demand something we don't often practice at large scales: patience. We'd need to accept that. Replies might take a long time. Meanings would be ambiguous. We might never get the kind of clarity we crave. All of this raises a hard question. Should we actively try to make contact? Some would say yes. That knowledge is worth the risk. That cooperation could help both sides survive crises like climate change, and that hiding from our neighbors is neither honest nor sustainable. Others would argue no, that given our track record, it's safer not to intrude on a hidden civilization that may be living more sustainably than we are, and that leaving them alone is the most ethical choice. It's a version of a debate we're already having about messaging extraterrestrial intelligence. Do we shout into the dark, or listen quietly and prepare? Here, though, the dark is very close. The decisions we make about fishing, pollution, climate, and sonar already affect whoever might be there, whether they reveal themselves or not. Which brings us to another layer: time. Even if contact never happens in the way we imagine, both civilizations, if there are indeed two, are moving through time on the same planet, influencing each other indirectly through shared environment. Their sense of time, however, would be shaped by currents and cycles we barely notice. To understand them, or even to consider how they watch us, we have to think about what time means in a world without dawn. On land, we barely separate time from light. Our days are built around sunrise and sunset, our years around the tilt of our planet and the march of seasons. Even our deepest metaphors treat time as something you can see. Dawn of a new era. The twilight of an age. Strip away sun and sky, and those anchors vanish. In the deep ocean, there is no visible dawn, no noon, no evening. Just a long, almost unbroken night, veined with currents and punctuated by flickers of living light. If a civilization has grown there, their sense of time would grow from very different roots. Instead of watching shadows, they would watch flows. Ocean currents are vast, slow rivers of water that loop around basins, rise and fall, shift with seasons and climate. Some are steady, others pulse. To those who live inside them, they're as real and reliable as trade winds or monsoons. Time could be measured by the return of a particular current with its unique temperature and chemistry, the interval between nutrient-rich upwellings, the waxing and waning of marine snow, the constant fall of organic particles from above. Where we say a week, they might say one small cycle of this flow. Where we mark a year, they might mark one full turning of the great current. Food cycles would also become clocks. When the surface blooms with plankton, more organic matter drifts down. When it quiets, the snow thins. Deep communities already tune themselves to this invisible weather. A civilization might align festivals and migrations with periods of peak marine snow, use the arrival of certain animal swarms, squid, fish, jellyfish, as seasonal markers, organize work and rest around feast and lean times. Pressure gradients could be another layer. Moving up or down by tens or hundreds of meters changes the forces on your body and structures. If communities are spread across depth bands, then depth itself becomes a kind of temporal marker. Those who have descended this far might be analogous to those of this age in our world. Darkness as constant would change how they experience the passage of moments. We know from experiments on land that humans kept in windowless spaces without clocks quickly lose track of day length. Some stretch their internal days long, others compress them. Time becomes elastic. Underwater, without sun or moon, that elasticity might not be a problem to solve. It might be the norm. Their culture could develop with flexible sleep and wake cycles, not tightly synchronized like our 24-hour rhythm. Work and social activity keyed more to environmental cues, currents, food availability, than to fixed hours. A general tolerance for long pauses, slow changes, and extended waiting stories from around the world hint at this difference. Tales like Urashima Taro in Japan, where time passes much faster on the surface than in the undersea palace. Celtic stories of voyages to submerged lands where centuries slip by unnoticed. Myths in which visits to water realms result in strange time gaps. These all feel like narrative grappling with the disorientation of leaving the sun's clock. For an underwater people, that disconnect would be their everyday reality. Our way of obsessively slicing time into minutes and seconds might seem frantic, even childish. Their idea of soon and long ago could stretch wider. If survival depends on environmental cycles that take years to complete, then planning for a few cycles from now would be normal. Patience could be baked into their psychology. Imagine, elders remembered not by years lived, but by how many major current shifts they've experienced. History told, not in reigns of kings, but in eras of vent activity, climate phases, or upwelling patterns. Myths that center on slow planetary rhythms rather than quick human dramas. Technology and communication would develop within that temporal frame. Where we build devices that tick and beep on strict schedules, they might build resonant structures that chime only when certain conditions align. Cyclical signals keyed to currents messages that take a full loop to return. Long-duration soundscapes that repeat over weeks or months as a kind of calendar. If they ever watched us closely, our compressed tempo would stand out starkly. We change coastlines in decades, overfish stocks in years, release enough carbon in a century to alter global climate. From the point of view of beings accustomed to slower cycles, we might look like a sudden, destabilizing event, less like a neighbor, more like a fast storm or a geological pulse. Contact, if it ever happens, would have to cross not just environmental and linguistic gaps, but these different experiences of time. We tend to expect rapid feedback. We send a signal and want an answer now or soon. We're uneasy with silence. They might expect conversations to unfold over much longer spans, with long intervals of apparent stillness. Where we hear absence, they might hear the necessary space between pulses. That mismatch alone could derail attempts at communication. We might interpret their slowness as disinterest or incapacity. They might interpret our urgency as volatility or danger. Yet, somewhere under all these differences, the shared reality remains. Both societies, if both exist, are moving through the same planetary time feeling, in their own ways, the same long changes in temperature, chemistry, and current as the climate shifts. Which draws us toward another question that goes beyond physics and cycles. What does such a world do to the inner life? What happens to minds, relationships, fears, and hopes in a place with no horizon, no sky, endless water, and constant pressure? How does that shape not just how they live, but who they are? To imagine a civilization under the sea, we can't stop at biology and engineering. We also have to ask how such an environment would press in on the mind, how it would shape emotion, perception, relationships, and the stories people tell themselves to stay whole. We take certain psychological anchors for granted on land, a horizon to steady our gaze, a sky that gives us a sense of up, ground that feels solid and still under our feet. In the deep ocean, all of those are gone. Below a certain depth, there is no visible horizon, only a fading cone of whatever faint light manages to get down, and then darkness in every direction. Up and down become gradients of pressure and temperature rather than obvious directions. You don't stand so much as suspend. Humans who dive into that space without training often experience disorientation and anxiety. They may not know which way is up. They can panic. To a people born into it, that same lack of boundaries would feel normal, but it would still shape them. Their sense of space would be more fluid and relational. We think of rooms, streets, and properties as solid, discrete slices of space. They might think of places as zones where certain combinations of sound, current, pressure, and community gather. Home might be less a box and more a familiar cluster of flows and presences. Moving through life, for them, might feel like traveling between densities rather than between addresses. Recognizing places by their sound and pressure, signatures rather than by landmarks. Trusting internal orientation that isn't visual at all. Darkness would play a huge role in inner life. We often associate darkness with fear, ignorance, or isolation. But in the deep, darkness is the default. It's not absence, it's the medium. Children there would grow up wrapped in it. To them, darkness could feel safe, intimate, protective. Brightness could be startling, even abrasive, something to be used sparingly. Privacy might be about controlling light and sound, not about walls and doors. The quiet of the deep is another major shaper. It isn't truly silent. There is always some crackle, distant rumble, or organic noise. But compared to our cities, it's overwhelmingly calm. Our minds are saturated with constant input. Theirs might be far more attuned to subtle variation. Psychologically, that might mean a baseline expectation of stillness, anxiety triggered more by abrupt noise than by quiet, social norms that value measured, deliberate expression over chatter, constant pressure, the literal physical weight of the water, would also feed into their sense of self. We use pressure as a metaphor for emotional and social strain. In their world, pressure is comfort and containment. It's the feeling of being in the right place. Only when that pressure is wrong, too little, too much, changing too fast, would it feel threatening. Their internal language might reflect that inversion. I feel held, where we might say, I feel under pressure. I'm floating, as a sign of disorientation or vulnerability. Weight and depth as positive metaphors for stability and wisdom. Scarcity and interdependence would shape social psychology powerfully. With limited food, oxygen, and safe spaces, individual survival would be tightly tied to group behavior. A single reckless act wasting air, damaging a crucial structure, Over-harvesting a delicate ecosystem could put many at risk. That might produce strong social norms around restraint and sharing, deep suspicion of selfishness, high value placed on reliability and cooperation. Punishments and conflicts might focus less on physical harm and more on exclusion from shared resources or from the group's protective patterns. Solitude in such a context would be complicated. On land, we often seek being alone as rest or reflection. In the deep, drifting too far from the group could mean literal danger, losing contact with sound cues, lights, or known pressure gradients. Psychological comfort might come from proximity, from feeling others' movements and echoes nearby. Children would likely be raised in close, almost continuous contact with family and community, not just emotionally but physically touch, shared currents, synchronized movement. That could create stronger baseline feelings of belonging, deeper fears around abandonment or exile, a self-concept that is less individualistic and more networked. There's also the matter of awe. Divers often talk about a sense of profound awe or transcendence in the ocean, feeling small in the best kind of way, overwhelmed by scale and strangeness. For an underwater civilization, that feeling could be part of everyday life. Everywhere they turn, they would be reminded. They live inside something vast and powerful. They are held by forces they cannot control. Their survival depends on reading those forces, not conquering them. Psychologically, that might tilt them toward spiritual or philosophical systems that emphasize humility and interconnection, rituals of gratitude or appeasement directed not at a sky god, but at the water and its deep processes, a sense of self that is porous, interconnected with environment rather than sitting above it. Their art would reflect all of this. On land, we paint and sculpt, build monuments that defy weather, write words that sit still on a page. Underwater, art might be ephemeral light performances in the dark, complex soundscapes composed from layered calls and echoes, choreographed group movements like living mandalas of motion and glow, carefully tended patterns in coral and other growth, slow art unfolding over decades. Dreams too would be different. Our dreams are often full of light, open spaces, skies, and falling. Theirs might be dominated by currents, pressure shifts, pulses of sound and light. Falling might not be a fear. Rising uncontrollably toward the surface might be the nightmare. The line between waking and dreaming might blur more easily. Both are lived in a medium that often feels boundaryless, both full of drifting dark and occasional bursts of brilliant sensation. Fear would take different shapes. We fear suffocation, heights, isolation in open spaces, darkness. They might fear sudden light and loud sounds, separation from the group signals, rogue currents or pressure drops, contamination of vital ecosystems, vents, farms, nurseries. Stories for their children would be built around those fears. Tales of drifting too far and losing the group's song. Warnings about playing near dangerous vents or unstable slopes. Parables about the dangers of greed and harvesting shared food sources. And yet, under all those differences, many human universals would likely persist. Love, loss, play, curiosity, the urge to explore, the pain of grief, the joy of belonging. These don't belong exclusively to land. They arise from being conscious, relational beings in a finite world. Their lullabies might be low pulses instead of soft voices, but they would still be lullabies. Their festivals might be choreographed currents and light, but they would still be festivals. Their mourning might be done in darkness and silence rather than under open sky, but it would still be mourning. Seen this way, the deep stops, feeling like a place that erases humanity and starts looking like a place that would reshape it. And that brings us back to us. Because whether or not such a civilization actually exists, entertaining the possibility changes how we look at the ocean we share. It stops being a simple resource or mystery and becomes something closer to a neighbor's home, full of histories we don't know, choices we don't see, and perhaps even eyes watching us from the dark. Which leads naturally to the last, quietly unsettling question. If the ocean is this good at hiding its own stories, what else is it holding? What secrets, biological, historical, or cultural, are resting down there right now, untouched by our instruments, waiting for a moment when either we become careful enough to see them or they decide to rise? The ocean has always been our planet's greatest keeper of secrets. It smooths over footprints in minutes. It grinds wreckage into silt. It wraps everything in layers of pressure and darkness that our tools struggle to penetrate. For most of human history, the sea marked the edge of the known world, not just physically, but mentally. Beyond this line, things disappear. On a straightforward level, we know it hides landscapes. Beneath the waves lie mountain chains taller than anything on land, trenches deeper than the Grand Canyon, plateaus the size of countries, and entire drowned continents where ancient river valleys now host cold water corals and strange fish instead of forests and fields. Places that were once dry, broad coastal plains, deltas, river mouths, now rest under tens or hundreds of meters of water. Any dwellings, shrines, or early cities they held were swallowed quietly when ice sheets melted and shorelines advanced. We've confirmed some of these. Submerged structures near India's Gulf of Kambat and Dwarka. Stoneworks off the coasts of the Mediterranean, Japan, and elsewhere. Buried channels and ghost rivers mapped by sonar under modern seas. But those are almost certainly only the first few pages of a much thicker book. The ocean also hides life. Every time we send a submersible or autonomous vehicle somewhere new, we find organisms we've never cataloged before. Fish with transparent heads, invertebrates that glow in shifting colors, microbes feeding directly on rock or vent chemicals. Some species live centuries. Some survive pressures that would crush our machines. Some blur lines between individual and colony. The fact that we keep finding them so easily in the few places we look suggests that our picture of ocean life is still wildly incomplete. Yet secrets of geology and biology may be the simplest ones. The ocean hides history. Every wreck on the seafloor, from Bronze Age traders to 20th century warships, is a sealed time capsule. Barnacle-covered hulls still hold cargo, tools, coins, weapons, personal items. In cold, deep, oxygen-poor waters, wooden structures and even textiles can survive astonishingly well. That's just from the last few thousand years. Go back further into the drowned shorelines of the late Ice Age, and the ocean may be sheltering remnants of settlements that predate anything we've dug up on land post holes in now buried sands, stone circles on former headlands, walls and hearths in what are now low sloping continental shelves. Our myths of lost coasts, sunken temples, and vanished harbors may be dim reflections of those buried realities. The sea also hides its own moods and dangers. Earthquakes under the ocean, submarine landslides, and volcanic eruptions can send tsunamis racing toward coasts. From our point of view on land, these disasters seem to blow in from nowhere. But from the seafloor's perspective, they're part of its normal convulsions. An underwater civilization, if it exists, would likely understand those rhythms far better than we do. Patterns we experience as surprise might, to them, be as predictable as seasons. There are stranger secrets, too, in the realm of sound. Hydrophones have picked up low-frequency hums, upsweeps, booms, and drawn-out groans that we still can't fully explain. Some have been linked to volcanic activity, ice movement, or storms. Others remain without a clear source. We give them whimsical names. The bloop, the upsweep, the Julia. But behind the nicknames is a quiet admission. The ocean voices things we haven't decoded. Those sounds might all come from geology and weather, or some could be signals from life we don't yet understand. Either way, they're reminders that the ocean is not acoustically empty. It's full of information that we're only beginning to notice. And then there are the secrets we've put there ourselves. We've sunk waste, lost containers, scattered munitions, and laid cables across vast distances. The seabed is already a kind of human archive. Broken ships, lost aircraft, dumped equipment, forgotten experiments. If someone were to study our civilization long after we're gone, the most complete record might not be on land at all, but in layered sediments and rusted forms under the waves. This all points to a broader idea. The ocean is an archive that doesn't arrange itself for our convenience. It files things according to currents, chemistry, and topography, not according to our historical periods or categories. And in that archive, if there is or ever was another civilization, its traces would be among the hardest to distinguish. If they're gone, their remnants may be so fused with geology and biology that we barely recognize them. If they're still here, hidden, they may actively erase or disguise their footprints the way we try to hide submarines or encrypted signals. When we look out at the sea now, we mostly see surface. Ripples, waves, color changes. It looks simple, but layered underneath are physical structures we haven't mapped in detail, ecosystems we haven't cataloged, cultural and geological histories we haven't pieced together, soundscapes we haven't learned to read. So what happens if something long hidden chooses to come into view? Or if we simply stumble upon it, despite its efforts to remain unseen? That thought leads to the final, quietly profound possibility we've been circling. That if a first civilization did go under the waves instead of inland, it may have been watching us grow this whole time. Not as myth, but as a parallel presence sharing the same planet, letting us believe we're alone. From here, it's worth pausing at that edge, because whether or not such neighbors are real, sitting with the idea changes something in us. It asks us to see the ocean not as empty, but as potentially inhabited. Not as a dump or a frontier to conquer, but as a realm where our actions have consequences for stories we don't yet know. Echoes of the Forgotten Earth will close this long dive in the next part, coming back to the shoreline, looking again at our own world in the light of everything we've imagined beneath the waves. Imagine standing at the edge of the sea again. Same beach, same sound of waves, same line where water meets sand, the same scene you've seen since childhood, the same scene your ancestors saw long before there were maps or machines. Now add, quietly, one new assumption. This is not empty. You don't know who is there. You don't know how many. You don't know if they're distant, disinterested, or very close. You only know that somewhere beyond the surf line, below the reach of sunlight, there may be minds as old as ours, or older, moving through a world we barely touch. You can't prove it. You can't disprove it. You simply let the possibility stand. Immediately, several things change. First, the scale of we. For most of our history, we meant a small circle, our band, our village, our tribe. Then it widened, our kingdom, our religion, our nation, our species. Somewhere along the way, we began to say we humans, as if the story of Earth were, fundamentally, our story. Add the ocean as a possible seat of another civilization, and that confidence wobbles. We becomes we, and perhaps someone else. Not above us, not beyond the stars, but here, sharing the same gravity, the same climate, the same slow tectonic drift. We go from sole protagonists to co-tenants. Second, the meaning of myth shifts. Flood stories, drowned cities, palaces under the sea, half-water beings, strange voices in storms. These stop being either literally true or just stories. They become something more interesting. Possible records of deep encounters between humans, water, and maybe others. They remind us that cultures have long suspected the sea of holding more than fish and storms. Even if no hidden people dwell there, our ancestors were right about one thing. The ocean is not a blank. Third, our sense of discovery changes direction. We usually think of exploration as us going out to new continents, new planets, new technologies. But if a hidden civilization exists, the real explorers in this relationship might not be us at all. They would have been watching as coasts filled with lights, ships multiplied, Strange materials appeared in the water. Currents warmed and chemistry shifted. They may already know far more about us than we do about them. Our traffic patterns, our noise, our habits. To them, we're the mysterious late arrival, loud and fast, reshaping shorelines in the span of a few of their seasons. Fourth, ethics stop being an abstract discussion. Right now, debates about the deep ocean tend to revolve around resources, fisheries, mining, shipping lanes, protected areas. We ask what we can take, what we should leave, and how to balance economy with ecology. Add even a sliver of doubt. Someone might already be living there in ways we don't see. And the question tilts. Deep sea mining, seismic blasting, indiscriminate trawling, dumping waste. These are no longer just ecological or economic choices. They become acts carried out, potentially, in another civilization's home. You don't need certainty for that to matter. You only need humility. Humility is, in fact, the quiet thread running through all of this. We are clever. We've walked on the moon, split the atom, sequenced genomes, built devices that talk across oceans at the speed of light. It's tempting to conclude that if something as large as a civilization existed on our world, we'd know. But then we remember. We've mapped Mars better than our own seafloor. We discover new deep sea species almost every serious expedition. We still argue over whether certain underwater formations are natural or worked. We've only been listening systematically to ocean sound for a few decades. The honest position is not they are there or they are not. It's we don't know. And given the ocean's size and opacity, we don't know. May be the only defensible answer for a long time. What we do know is this. The ocean has been rising and falling for millions of years. Humans and pre-human ancestors have lived with it, beside it, and in it for a very long time. Entire coastal ways of life have been erased and remembered only as story and stone. Life in the deep is stranger and more adaptable than we imagined even a generation ago. From those facts, it's a short, entirely reasonable step to say, if any place on Earth could hide another long story, it's there. The rest, breath, and pressure, sound and darkness, architecture and myth is an attempt to flesh out that simple possibility into a world you can feel, even if it never existed. So what do we do with that? One response is to treat it as pure speculation and walk away unchanged. Another is to use it as a lens, a way to look differently at things that are undeniably real. The Bajau and other sea peoples whose lives already blur land and water. Submerged ruins that prove our coasts are not fixed and never were. The damage we're doing to coral reefs, fisheries, and deep habitats we barely understand. The myths and art that show how deeply the sea has always lived in our imagination. Seen through this lens, even if there is no hidden civilization, we still owe the ocean more respect than we've given it. We owe its known inhabitants space to exist. We owe future generations a world where the deep is more than a strip-mined, noise-filled corridor. And if, someday, we do find something unexpected, anomalous structures we can't explain away, patterned sounds that truly look like language, or even a direct encounter, we'll be better prepared if we've already allowed for the idea that we are not alone. Prepared to listen before speaking. Ask what we can offer instead of what we can take. Accept that our way of being intelligent is not the only way. Echoes of the Forgotten Earth was never about proving that a first civilization survives in the sea. It's about loosening the grip of our certainty long enough to see our world as layered, haunted by its own past, and potentially shared. It's also about remembering that we too are temporary. Ice will move again. Seas will shift again. Our cities, as solid as they feel, are as vulnerable to time and water as any stone circle or harbor from 10,000 years ago. One day, some of them will lie beneath waves. Some already do. Perhaps far in the future, someone else, human, other, or both, will drift over where those towers once stood, pick up a shaped fragment, and begin to tell a story. Maybe they'll call us a forgotten civilization. Maybe their myths will say we grew quickly, burned bright, and were gone. Maybe they'll imagine that we escaped into some realm they cannot reach. Maybe they'll stand at their own version of a shoreline, looking out into an element that hides our ruins, and wonder if we're still there. Whether or not anyone lives in the ocean's depths now, the pattern continues. Worlds appearing, flourishing, vanishing, leaving traces for whoever comes next to interpret. We happen to be alive at a moment when we can still choose how we'll be remembered by our ruins, by our damage, by our restraint, by our care. The ocean is watching in the only ways it can. And if there are eyes in that darkness, minds woven into those currents, then they are watching too. What we send into the water, the noise, the metal, the poison, the curiosity, the care, may already be our side of a conversation we don't yet know how to hear. The rest is up to us.